for the best, Clarabelle," my mother whispered, her voice cracking with manufactured grief as she pushed the pen into my hand. "We just want you to be safe. We can't watch you disappear like this." Across the mahogany desk, my brother Derek nodded solemnly, his foot bouncing with a greedy, frantic rhythm under the table. They were about to have me declared legally insane, stripped of my rights, my future, and the 8-figure trust fund my father had left me. That was the last day I stayed silent, because what happened next in that lawyer's office didn't just change everything. It unleashed a truth so damning, it would send them both to prison. But before I tell you what that audio file sounded like in the dead silence of that room, you need to understand the 2 years of fog they pushed me into. You need to know how they turned my own mind into a prison, and how the one soul in that room who knew the complete, unvarnished truth wasn't a person at all. If this story already resonates with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I'm sharing this because I know someone out there feels that same fog creeping in, and you need to know that you are not crazy. My name is Clara Reed, and this is the story of how my dog saved my life. It all began, as these things often do, not with a bang, but with a letter. A thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the letterhead of a prestigious law firm in Boston. It arrived on a Tuesday 2 years ago, a day that was otherwise unremarkable. I was in the kitchen of the old Victorian house I'd grown up in, the house I now shared with my mother and Derek. I was measuring out coffee grounds, trying to stave off the familiar thrum of an impending migraine. My biological father, Michael Reed, had been a ghost in my life. He and my mother divorced when I was 3, a bitter, messy affair that left Eleanor with the house and a deep-seated resentment she nursed like a precious heirloom. He'd moved across the country, sent birthday cards with cash until I was 10. And then, nothing. He passed away from a sudden heart attack 6 months before the letter arrived. I felt a distant, hollow sadness for the man I never knew. But my life, I thought, would remain unchanged. The letter stated that Michael Reed, a man I'd been told was a struggling artist, had in fact been a shockingly successful software developer. He had established a trust in my name years ago. The contents were, to put it mildly, astronomical. A sum with enough zeros to make your head spin. But there was a stipulation, a piece of foresight for which I will be eternally grateful. I wouldn't gain full, unconditional control of the principal until my 30th birthday. Until then, the estate would cover my living expenses, but the capital, the real power, was locked away. I remember my hands shaking as I read it. I didn't see the dollar signs. I saw freedom. Freedom from the worry of patching the leaky roof. Freedom from my part-time job as a graphic designer. Freedom to maybe, finally, move out on my own. I showed the letter to my mother. Her face went pale. Then a strange, hungry light flickered in her eyes. Derek, who had wandered in to see what the fuss was about, just let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder with a familiarity he rarely showed. "Looks like little Clara hit the jackpot." That night, for the first time in years, my mother cooked my favorite meal, lasagna from scratch. Derek opened a bottle of wine. They toasted to me, to my future, to our new beginning. They were so kind, so attentive, so full of love. It felt like a dream. It wasn't. It was the beginning of the long con. The first gentle, loving push into the abyss. They didn't see a daughter or a sister sitting at that table. They saw a vault. And they had just discovered the combination would be delivered in 2 years. They had 730 days to steal the key. And they knew exactly where to start looking. Inside my head. The change was subtle at first, insidious. It started with small things, tiny moments of manufactured confusion designed to make me question my own perceptions. It was gaslighting, of course, but at the time, I didn't have a name for it. It just felt like my brain was fraying at the edges. My favorite ceramic mug, the one I used every morning, vanished. I searched the whole house for it. When I asked my mother, she looked at me with those wide, concerned eyes she'd perfected. "Oh, honey, don't you remember?" she'd said, her voice soft as cashmere. "You dropped it last week. It shattered. You were so upset. You swept it up yourself." I had no memory of this. None. But she described it with such vivid detail. The way the handle broke off clean, the sound it made hitting the tile. She sounded so certain. And I was so used to the brain fog that sometimes accompanied my migraines that I just accepted it. "I guess my head's been all over the place," I'd mumbled, and she'd patted my hand. "It's okay, sweetie. We're here for you." A few days later, Derek asked me to pick up his dry cleaning on my way home. I wrote it down on a sticky note and put it on my dashboard. When I got home, he was furious. "Clara, I needed that suit for a job interview tomorrow. Why do you always do this?" I stared at him, bewildered. "Do what?" He jabbed a finger towards my car. "You just forget. You're so unreliable." I went out to my car, and the sticky note was gone. I knew I had put it there. I could picture my own handwriting on the yellow square, but it wasn't there. Derek stormed off, muttering about how I was getting more and more flaky. My mother just sighed, that sad, disappointed sigh that made me feel about 2 inches tall. These little incidents began to stack up, one on top of the other, forming a foundation of self-doubt. They were masters of plausible deniability. A lost set of keys, an appointment I'd supposedly forgotten, a conversation I had no recollection of. Each time they would exchange a worried glance, a silent communication that screamed, "See? It's getting worse." They were planting a seed, watering it with their feigned concern, and waiting for it to take root in the fertile ground of my own insecurity. The real masterstroke, however, came about 3 months in. My migraines, a chronic issue since my teens, had been a constant battle. I had a prescription that worked reasonably well, keeping the worst of the pain and nausea at bay. One afternoon, Eleanor sat me down at the kitchen table, her face a mask of loving anxiety. "Clarabelle," she began, taking my hands in hers, "I've been so worried about you. These headaches, and your memory." I was talking to a friend of mine, and she told me about this wonderful new neurologist, Dr. Finch. He specializes in complex cases. "I took the liberty of making an appointment for you." I should have been suspicious. My mother had never taken an active interest in my medical care before. But I was tired. Tired of the pain. Tired of the constant feeling that I was losing my grip. The idea of a new doctor, a new solution, felt like a lifeline. Dr. Finch's office was the epitome of expensive, minimalist chic. He had a calm, reassuring demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He listened patiently as I described my symptoms. Eleanor, who had insisted on coming with me, would gently interrupt. "And the memory loss, doctor?" she'd add. "She's been forgetting entire conversations. It's not like her." And the confusion. Derek, who had also mysteriously decided to join, would chime in. "Sometimes she just stares into space, completely lost." They painted a picture of me that was both familiar and distorted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Dr. Finch nodded, his face unreadable. He prescribed a new medication. "This is a state-of-the-art preventative," he'd explained. "It has a much higher efficacy rate for cases with cognitive side effects like yours." He gave me a sample bottle right there in the office. He told me to stop my old medication immediately and start this new one tonight. I felt a surge of hope. That night, I took the small white pill. The next morning, the fog I'd been feeling was thicker. My head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. When I tried to work on a design project, I couldn't focus. The lines on the screen seemed to swim. Over the next few weeks, things got demonstrably worse. The pills didn't prevent migraines. They seemed to induce a constant, low-grade version of their worst cognitive symptoms. I was clumsy, disoriented, and, yes, forgetful. My reality was becoming a slippery, unreliable thing. And through it all, my mother and Derek were there, propping me up, guiding me through the haze they had created. "Easy there, sweetie," my mother would say as I stumbled on a step. "Derek, help your sister. She's having a bad day." They were the architects of my decline, and now they were positioning themselves as my saviors. I was becoming utterly dependent on my own poisoners. It was the perfect trap, and I had walked into it willingly, gratefully even. It was around this time, when the fog felt densest, that I decided to get a dog. I didn't know it then, but it was the first decision I'd made for my own survival. The idea of getting a dog wasn't a sudden whim. It was a deep, primal yearning for a connection that was simple and true. In a world that was becoming increasingly confusing, where my own memories were being called into question, the uncomplicated loyalty of a dog felt like an anchor. I didn't just want a pet. I was grappling with a level of anxiety I'd never known. The constant disorientation and the fear that I was genuinely losing my mind would send my heart into a frantic, hammering rhythm. I'd read about psychiatric service dogs, animals trained not just for companionship, but to perform specific tasks to help mitigate mental health disabilities. When I brought up the idea, Eleanor was surprisingly supportive. "Oh, Clara, what a wonderful idea," she'd exclaimed. "A little companion to look after you. It will give you a sense of purpose." Derek just shrugged, more interested in his phone. "Just make sure it doesn't piss on the rug," was his only contribution. I see now, of course, that they saw a dog as just another prop in their play. A fluffy, four-legged testament to my growing fragility. They never imagined he would become the one witness they couldn't corrupt. After weeks of research, I found a reputable organization that trained Labradors for psychiatric support. They matched me with a 2-year-old yellow lab named Buster. The day I met him, he walked into the room, took one look at me, and rested his big, blocky head on my knee as if he'd been doing it his whole life. He was calm, steady, and his eyes held a quiet intelligence that felt ancient. He was everything I wasn't at that moment. Buster was trained for several tasks. He could perform pressure therapy, DPT, by laying his full weight across my lap during a panic attack. He was trained to recognize the scent of rising cortisol in my sweat and nudge my hand to interrupt dissociative episodes. He could lead me out of overwhelming public spaces and create a physical barrier between me and strangers if I felt crowded. He was, in essence, a living, breathing medical device with a wagging tail. Bringing him home changed the atmosphere of the house. For me, his presence was a constant, warm reassurance. He'd follow me from room to room, a silent, watchful shadow. When I'd wake in the night, heart pounding from a nameless dread, his soft snores from the foot of the bed would ground me back in reality. For Eleanor and Derek, he was initially a novelty. Eleanor would coo at him, scratching behind his ears. "Aren't you a good boy looking after our Clara?" she'd say, the words dripping with condescension. Derek would occasionally toss a ball for him in the yard, a brief performance of normalcy before he retreated back into his own world of online poker and mounting debts. But soon, they began to incorporate Buster into their narrative of my decline. "It's a shame, really," I overheard Eleanor telling a neighbor over the back fence one afternoon, "that Clara needs a dog just to get through the day. Her father's side of the family, well, there were issues. We're just praying it hasn't been passed down." She said it with such sorrow, such deep concern, that the neighbor was eating out of the palm of her hand. The first time Buster truly exposed their game, I almost missed it. We were in the living room. Derek had just discovered that a bill, which he was supposed to have mailed for me, was a week overdue, and we were about to be hit with a hefty late fee. He threw the red-stamped envelope on the coffee table. "God, Clara, can't you do anything right?" he snapped. "This is the 3rd time this month. Do you have any idea how much money you're costing us with your carelessness? His voice was sharp, accusatory. My chest tightened instantly. My breath hitched. My heart started that familiar panicked gallop. It was the exact trigger for the anxiety attacks they had been so worried about. I braced myself for the dizzying spiral. Then something happened. Buster, who had been dozing by the fireplace, lifted his head. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He stood up, walked over to me, and calmly, deliberately, placed his front paws on the sofa and pushed his head and chest firmly against mine. He was initiating a calming pressure task. But then, after a moment, he seemed to sense something was off. He pulled back, looked at me, whined softly, and then just sat down at my feet, perfectly relaxed. It was the incongruity that struck me. My heart was racing, my palms were sweating, all the physical signs of a panic attack. But Buster, a dog trained to react to the biochemical markers of genuine, uncontrollable panic, had started a task and then abandoned it, as if to say, "Nope, false alarm." He was reacting to my initial shock and hurt, but not to the cascading, out-of-control, hormonal flood of a true panic episode. It was a small thing, a flicker of dissonance in the carefully constructed reality they had built. But it was the first time I thought, that's weird. He should be doing more. My body was screaming panic, but my dog was telling me a different story. He was telling me that whatever I was feeling, it wasn't the chemical storm of a mental breakdown. It was the logical, physiological response to being bullied. For the first time in a long time, a tiny sliver of doubt pierced the fog. And it wasn't doubt in myself. It was doubt in them. That single, strange interaction with Buster became a kernel of clarity in my otherwise clouded mind. It was a data point that didn't fit the equation they had written for me. I started paying closer attention, not to my own perceived failings, but to the world around me, and specifically to Buster's reactions. He became my barometer for reality, a furry, four-legged truth-teller in a house built on lies. The gaslighting didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. They were on a deadline, after all. My 30th birthday was a finish line they were determined to cross first. The incidents became more blatant. One morning, I came downstairs to find the front door wide open. My mother was in the kitchen, her face pale with fright. "Clara, you left the door wide open all night," she cried, rushing to bolt it. "Anyone could have walked in. My God, child, what is wrong with you?" I knew I hadn't. I was meticulous about locking the doors. It was a ritual. But the evidence was right there. Derek came thundering down the stairs. "Again? I told you she did this last week, Mom. She just doesn't remember." My head spun. Could I have? Was my mind now so broken that I was leaving my own family vulnerable? I felt a wave of shame and fear wash over me. My heart began to pound. And then I looked at Buster. He was sitting by his water bowl, calmly lapping it up. He hadn't barked once during the night. A stranger, a draft, any unusual noise would have had him on his feet, issuing a low warning growl. But he had slept peacefully. His calm was a silent, powerful testimony against their hysteria. He was my alibi. Another time, Eleanor claimed I'd had a frightful episode in the garden. "You were just standing there by the rose bushes, talking to yourself," she told me later, her voice trembling. "It was gibberish, honey. It went on for 10 minutes. It scared me to death." I had been in the garden, yes, but I had been pulling weeds and humming a song from the radio. I was sure of it. But her description was so detailed, so full of terrified concern. "I called your name and you didn't even turn around," she'd added, twisting the knife. The old me would have dissolved into a puddle of self-doubt. But the new me, the me that was learning to trust my dog over my mother, did a quick mental check. Where had Buster been? Lying in the sun on the patio, not 5 feet away from me. If I had been shouting or acting erratically, he would have been on his feet, alert, nudging me, trying to break the behavior. But he had been sunbathing. They were getting sloppy. Their lies were growing bolder, but my tool for verifying reality was getting sharper. Chó không biết nói dối. A dog doesn't know how to lie. He responds to what is, not what someone tells him is. His stability was a mirror reflecting their madness, not mine. The world they were creating for me was a fiction, and Buster was the one character who refused to learn his lines. The realization didn't come in a sudden cinematic flash. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It was the understanding that the pills Dr. Finch had given me weren't to help my migraines, but to create the very confusion they were using as evidence against me. It was the sickening comprehension that every lost item, every forgotten conversation, was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. This wasn't concern. This was a conspiracy. One evening, I decided to test my theory. I palmed the pill Dr. Finch had prescribed, and when I went to get a glass of water, I dropped it down the sink. I did the same thing the next day, and the day after that. After 72 hours without the medication, the thickest part of the fog began to lift. It was like a radio slowly coming into focus. The static was still there, but for the first time in months, I could hear the music. My thoughts felt sharper, more linear. I could hold a complex idea in my head without it slipping away like sand through my fingers. That night, lying in bed with Buster's heavy form a warm weight against my legs, the full scope of their betrayal crashed down on me. They weren't just trying to control my money, they were trying to annihilate me, to erase the competent, intelligent woman I was and replace her with a fragile, helpless child they could control. They wanted to break my mind to get to my bank account. The grief was staggering. It felt like my mother had died, and in her place was this cold, calculating stranger. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring. A cold, hard knot of anger. It was an anger so pure and so potent, it burned away the last vestiges of fear and confusion. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They had mistaken my trust for stupidity. They thought they were driving me mad. They had no idea they were about to make me dangerous. I wasn't going to have a breakdown. I was going to have a breakthrough. And my secret weapon was snoring softly at the foot of my bed. My first instinct was to scream, to confront them, to throw the pills in their faces, to rage against the dying of my own light. I wanted to see the shock on their faces when the puppet cut its own strings. But as I lay there, stroking Buster's soft ears, a different, colder logic took hold. What would happen if I confronted them? They would deny everything. They would twist my righteous anger into another symptom of my illness. You see, doctor, this is what we mean, these violent, paranoid outbursts. They had Dr. Finch in their pocket. They had spent months, maybe over a year, laying the groundwork, telling friends and neighbors about my decline. It would be my word, the word of a supposedly unstable woman, against theirs. I had no proof. Not yet. And so a new plan began to form, a strategy born from the clarity of my anger. If they wanted me to be weak, I would be the weakest woman they had ever seen. If they wanted me to be confused, I would be a master of bewildered helplessness. I would not only play the part they had written for me, I would give the performance of a lifetime. I would let them think they were winning. I would draw them in so close, let them get so comfortable in their lies, that when the trap finally sprung, they would have no idea what hit them. The next morning, I made a show of stumbling into the kitchen, rubbing my temples. I slept horribly, I mumbled, slurring my words just slightly. Such strange dreams. Eleanor rushed to my side, her face a perfect portrait of concern. Oh, you poor thing. Here, let me make you some tea. I let her guide me to a chair. I forgot where the sugar was. I stared blankly at the newspaper for a solid minute, before asking what day it was. I was every bit the part of the fragile, fading daughter. I could see the flicker of triumph in her eyes, quickly masked by pity. Derek walked in, and I gave him a vacant smile. He smirked back when he thought I wasn't looking. They were buying it completely. My new weakness became my shield. They stopped trying so hard because they thought their work was done. Their conversations around me became less guarded. They'd discuss my condition as if I wasn't even there, a piece of furniture that just happened to be breathing. This was my opening. Buster, bless his loyal heart, was confused at first. My scent was changing. The cortisol spikes of anxiety were being replaced by the steady, low hum of adrenaline and focus. But I was acting weak and scared. He'd nudge me, trying to offer comfort for a distress that wasn't chemically present. I had to learn to mimic the physical signals, to tremble just enough to let my breathing become shallow, so that his comforting actions would align with the persona I was projecting. It was the hardest acting I've ever had to do. Now, for the proof. I needed to catch them. I needed their own words, their own voices, to be the architects of their downfall. An idea, audacious and risky, began to take shape. Buster was my shadow, my constant companion. He was also completely invisible to them. He was a fixture, a part of the scenery. He slept under the dining room table during their hushed dinner conversations. He lay at my mother's feet in the living room while she made worried phone calls. He was the perfect mobile surveillance unit. I spent a week researching online, using incognito mode on my laptop late at night when they were asleep. I needed a listening device. Something tiny, with a long battery life, excellent range, and preferably waterproof. I found what I was looking for on a site that specialized in private investigation equipment. A micro recorder, no bigger than a thumbnail, advertised for covert audio capture. I paid for it with a prepaid credit card and had it delivered to a P.O. box I set up in the next town over. Getting it was a challenge. I had to feign a sudden, irrational craving for a specific type of donut from a bakery in that town. My mother was hesitant to let me drive. "Are you sure you're feeling up to it, honey?" she'd asked. I had to put on a pathetic, pleading performance. "Please, Mom, it's the only thing that sounds good. I'll be so careful." She finally relented, probably thinking a fender bender would only help their case. The device was a marvel of miniaturization. That night, with my heart pounding in my throat, I performed surgery on Buster's collar. He wore a thick, padded nylon collar for comfort. With a seam ripper and a needle and thread, I carefully opened a section of the inner padding, slipped the tiny device inside, and sewed it back up with painstaking care. It was undetectable. You could feel a small, hard lump if you knew exactly where to press, but to a casual touch, it was just part of the collar. I activated it. A tiny, nearly invisible blue light blinked once and then went dark. It was on. It was listening. The next evening, I feigned a severe headache and went to bed early, leaving Buster downstairs. "He's too restless," I'd complained. "I need complete quiet." My door clicked shut, and my spy, with his wagging tail and soulful brown eyes, went to work. I lay in the dark, my ears straining, imagining the collar around his neck, a silent witness, drinking in the poison they spoke in the safety of their perceived victory. The waiting was the hardest part, but I knew with every fiber of my being that they would give me exactly what I needed. It was only a matter of time. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I lived a dual life. On the outside, I was Ophelia, drifting towards madness. I would leave sentences unfinished, stare at walls, and cry for no apparent reason. I let my appearance go, wearing the same sweatpants for days, my hair uncombed. I was becoming the ghost they wanted me to be. Inside, however, a razor-sharp focus had taken hold. I was a general planning a campaign, and every sigh, every tear, every vacant stare was a strategic maneuver. Every night I would stage my retreat. I'd claim to be exhausted or overwhelmed and lock myself in my room, leaving Buster to roam the downstairs. "I just can't handle the noise from the TV," I'd whisper, knowing full well he would settle in the living room right between them. He was my Trojan horse, welcomed past the gates, carrying my secret army in his collar. After they went to bed, I would call him quietly into my room. With trembling hands, I'd connect the collar to my laptop via a tiny magnetic cable. The files would transfer in the darkness, small packets of data that held my entire future. The first few nights were a bust. The recordings were mostly muffled sounds of the television, the clinking of glasses, mundane chatter. They were still cautious. But then, on the fourth night, I hit gold. It was Derek's voice, low and venomous. "Just sitting there, staring at the damn salt shaker for 5 minutes straight. She's completely losing it. Dr. Finch's new pills are working even better than he said." My mother's voice, tight with excitement. "Patience, Derek. We can't rush this. The lawyer said we need a consistent pattern of behavior. The hearing for the conservatorship is scheduled for the 23rd, a week before her birthday. The timing will be perfect." My blood ran cold. A date. They had a date. They had a lawyer. This wasn't some vague, malevolent wish. It was a scheduled, logistical plan. A conservatorship. The legal mechanism used for people so incapacitated they can't feed or clothe themselves. The word Britney Spears had made infamous. They were going to put me in a legal cage. "What about the money?" Derek pressed, his voice greedy. "Finch wants another 10 grand after the papers are signed." "He'll get it," Eleanor snapped. "It's a drop in the bucket. Once we have control, the first thing we're doing is paying off your debts." She said the word with disgust. "All of it. We'll tell the estate manager it's for a new experimental treatment for Clara in Switzerland. Something long-term." I had to clap a hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. The sheer cold-blooded audacity of it. They were already spending my money, inventing new lies to cover their tracks. They were going to pay off Derek's gambling losses with my father's legacy. Liability. A crutch. Once she's in a proper facility, they won't allow pets. We'll surrender him to a shelter. It's for the best. He'll get adopted quickly. Surrender him. My Buster. My anchor, my sanity, my only friend in this hell. They were going to take him from me and dump him in a cage. The thought ignited a fire in my chest so hot it burned away the last of my tears. This was no longer just about money or freedom. This was about him. I would see them in hell before I let them lay a hand on my dog. I saved the file, naming it Conspiracy_01. I cleared the device and sent my little spy back out for another night's work. From then on, the recordings became a flood of incriminating evidence. I captured them laughing about how I'd tried to put milk in the pantry. I recorded them discussing the fake journal Eleanor was writing, detailing my episodes to present as evidence. I got the full name of the lawyer they were using, a man named Marcus Thorne. The most damning recording came about a week later. It was a phone call Eleanor took on speakerphone. It was Dr. Finch. "Eleanor, you have to be careful." His voice was tinny, nervous. "The board is doing random audits this quarter. My neck is on the line here. The medication I'm giving her, it's a mild antipsychotic, but at that dosage it's basically just a sedative. It's designed to cause confusion and lethargy, but there's no physical way it would produce the schizophrenic symptoms you're describing in your journal. If you're ever deposed, you need to stick to the cognitive decline angle, the memory loss, the disorientation. Don't get creative." "Don't you worry about me, Alistair," my mother had purred. "I know how to handle myself. You just make sure your report is convincing. $5 million is a lot of money. Clara's life is at stake." The blatant lie, so easily spoken, sent a shiver down my spine. I saved the file. Dr_bribe. I now had the conspiracy, the motive, the co-conspirator, and the exact method. I had everything. All that was left was to let them walk me to my own execution, completely unaware that I was the one holding the axe. I looked at the calendar. The 23rd. 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks of playing the ghost in my own home. I could do it. For Buster, I could do anything. With the evidence secured and backed up in 3 separate locations, a cloud account, a thumb drive hidden in a hollowed-out book, and another I mailed to my P.O. box, the nature of the waiting game changed. It was no longer a desperate search for proof, but a calculated countdown to detonation. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, hyper-aware calm. I was an actress in the final run of a play, and I knew all my lines. My performance, ironically, became more convincing as the day of the hearing approached. The closer I got to freedom, the more authentically I could portray a woman falling apart. The strain of the deception was immense, and it began to manifest in ways that perfectly suited their narrative. I developed dark circles under my eyes from sleepless nights spent listening to audio files. I lost weight because my appetite was non-existent, my stomach a constant knot of adrenaline. I looked, for all intents and purposes, like a woman on the verge of a complete collapse. They saw it as the success of their plan. I knew it was the cost of my war. They decided, in their infinite cruelty, to isolate me completely. It started with my phone. I came downstairs one morning and it was gone from the charger. "I saw you with it out by the pond yesterday," Derek said with a shrug. "You probably dropped it in." I knew I hadn't, but I played the part, frantically searching the muddy bank of the small pond in our backyard while he watched from the window, a smug look on his face. Next was the internet. Eleanor called the cable company and had the service disconnected. "I'm so sorry, honey," she said, stroking my hair as I sat staring at a blank laptop screen. "Derek's been gambling online again. I had to cut it off. I know how much you need your connection, but he's out of control." It was a brilliant move. She blamed him, positioning herself as my ally while achieving her goal of cutting my last link to the outside world. I was now trapped in the house with my 2 tormentors, with no phone and no internet. The walls were closing in. The final step was the attic. The Victorian house had a large, finished attic room. It was stuffy and hot, with only a small, circular window overlooking the backyard. It was where they stored old furniture and forgotten memories. 2 weeks before the hearing, Eleanor came to me with a proposal wrapped in the language of love. "Clarabelle, Derek and I have been talking," she began, her voice syrupy sweet. "We think the stress of the main house, the comings and goings, it's all too much for you right now. The attic room is so quiet. We could move a comfortable bed up there for you. It could be your own private sanctuary, a place where you can rest and heal with no distractions." A sanctuary. They called it a sanctuary. I knew what it was. It was a cell. I put up a token resistance, just enough to be believable. "I don't know, Mom. It's so isolated up there." "That's the point, sweetie," she cooed. "Perfect peace and quiet." They moved a mattress and a small table into the room. They brought my meals up on a tray. The door, I noticed, had a new heavy-duty bolt on the outside. They told me it was for my own safety. "In case you wander at night," Derek said with a cruel grin. "Wouldn't want you to fall down the stairs." The first night they slid that bolt shut, the sound of the metal striking home echoed in the small space. I was officially a prisoner. The panic I had been feigning for weeks threatened to become real. The room was hot, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. I felt the walls pressing in. My heart began to race. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my head in my hands, and took deep, shuddering breaths. Then, I felt a wet nose nudge my hand. Buster. They had allowed Buster to stay with me, of course. He was my comfort animal. His presence validated their story. They had no idea they had just locked the key in the cell with the prisoner. He whined softly, sensing my genuine distress. He put his paws on the mattress and began to perform DPT, pressing his warm, heavy body against my shaking one. As his weight settled on me, a wave of calm washed through my body. I wrapped my arms around his neck and buried my face in his fur. He was real. This was real. I was not crazy. I was a prisoner of war, and this was my foxhole. Living in the attic was a descent into a surreal kind of limbo. I would mark the days on the wall behind the bed, a secret calendar counting down to my liberation. Buster was my only companion, my confidant. I would whisper all my plans to him in the dark, and he would listen, his tail thumping softly against the floorboards. The collar continued its silent work. Buster had the run of the house. They'd let him out into the yard, and he'd wander downstairs for water. He was their biggest mistake. I have a recording from one of those days where Derek is talking to someone on the phone about selling my car. Yeah, it's a new model, low mileage. The owner, she won't be needing it anymore. I can get you a great price. They thought they had me perfectly contained. They thought I was up in that hot, dusty room, my mind turning to soup, waiting for them to deliver the final blow. They were right about the waiting, but they were wrong about everything else. I wasn't waiting for the end. I was waiting for the beginning. The week of the hearing arrived with a suffocating stillness. The rhythm of my imprisonment had become grimly routine. 3 times a day, the bolt would slide back. Eleanor would bring a tray of food, her face a carefully constructed mask of pity. She'd ask me how I was feeling. I would respond with a mumble or a vacant stare. She'd sigh, shake her head sadly, and leave, the bolt sliding shut behind her, a sound that had become the punctuation mark of my days. Buster was my lifeline. His needs gave my days structure. I'd brush his coat, practice his commands in hushed tones, and play gentle games of fetch with a balled-up sock in the confines of our dusty room. His presence was a constant reminder of what was real and true in a world that had become a waking nightmare. Caring for him kept a part of my own humanity alive. The day before the hearing, the 22nd, was the day I retrieved the collar for the last time. It was the most dangerous part of the plan. I needed the device itself, not just the files. I had to create a believable reason for the collar to be removed and for me to be left alone with it. I spent the morning practicing. I took one of Buster's chew toys and rubbed it vigorously against a splintered section of the floorboards, fraying the edges. Then I waited. When Eleanor brought my lunch tray, I put the plan into action. I made sure Buster was chewing on the doctored toy. As my mother was about to leave, I let out a small, sharp cry. "Mom, wait!" I said, my voice full of panic. I pointed at Buster. "His collar! It's caught on something!" I had looped one of the frayed threads from the toy around the collar's buckle. "Off! Take it off!" I pleaded. My voice, "Off! Take it off!" I pleaded, my voice rising with hysteria. "He's going to choke!" My feigned panic was contagious. She fumbled with the buckle, her hands clumsy. "It's stuck! Derek, get up here!" Derek came lumbering up the stairs. "What the hell is all the noise?" "The dog's collar is stuck! Help me!" Between the two of them, they finally managed to unbuckle the collar. I snatched it from her hand, clutching it to my chest, panting heavily. "He's okay," I whispered, stroking Buster, who was looking at all of us as if we'd lost our minds. "For God's sake, Clara, it's just a collar," Derek sneered. "It could have hurt him," I sobbed, rocking back and forth. Eleanor put a hand on my shoulder. "It's all right, honey, he's fine. See? Let's just leave the collar off for today. Let him be comfortable. We'll put it back on tomorrow before we go out." It worked. Better than I could have dreamed. They saw my reaction as yet another sign of my unraveling, an irrational, hysterical attachment to the animal. They left me alone, locking the door behind them, leaving the collar, my most precious piece of evidence, lying on the mattress beside me. As soon as their footsteps faded, I went to work. My hands were shaking, but this time with adrenaline, not fear. I carefully ripped the seam I had sewn. The tiny black rectangle of the recorder slid into my palm. It felt warm. I tucked it deep into the pocket of the sweatpants I'd be wearing the next day. Then, with a needle and thread I had hidden weeks ago, I meticulously sewed the collar back up. It needed to look perfectly normal for the final act. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the small, round window, watching the stars appear in the sliver of sky I could see. I held the tiny device in my hand, a cold, hard piece of plastic that held all their lies. Tomorrow, they would dress me up and lead me like a lamb to the slaughter. They would walk me into a lawyer's office, expecting me to weep and stare blankly while they signed my life away. They had no idea I was bringing a bomb to the proceedings, and the detonator was in my pocket. I thought about my father, Michael Reed, a man I never knew, but who had, in his own way, provided for me. He'd left me his fortune, a gift that had almost destroyed me. But he had also given me a deadline, a firewall. His stipulation that I must be 30 had given me the one thing I needed most: time. Time to see the truth, time to plan, and time to fight back. Tomorrow was for him, and it was for Buster. And for the first time in a long time, it was for me. As dawn broke, painting the dusty window with shades of gray and rose, I felt a profound sense of peace. The performance was over. It was time for the curtain to fall. The morning of the 23rd dawned gray and oppressive, a perfect mirror for the atmosphere in the house. There was a funereal quiet as Eleanor came to my room, not with a tray, but with a set of clothes laid over her arm. A plain gray dress, soft, shapeless, and non-threatening. The uniform of a victim. "Time to get ready, sweetie," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "We have that appointment today, remember?" I nodded slowly, allowing my eyes to look unfocused and confused. I let her help me dress, playing the part of the compliant, broken doll to the very end. The tiny recorder was a hard, reassuring weight in the pocket of the cardigan she placed over my shoulders. As we were about to leave the attic room, I stopped. "Buster's collar," I said, my voice a near whisper. I pointed to where it lay on the bed. "He needs his collar." "Of course, honey," Eleanor said, her patience stretched thin. She grabbed it and quickly buckled it around his neck. It looked perfect, undisturbed. She had no idea she was arming my key witness. The drive to the lawyer's office was silent. I sat in the back seat with Buster, his head on my lap. I stared out the window, watching the world go by as if through a thick pane of glass. Derek drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, rehearsing her lines in her head, I was sure. They thought they were taking me to my judgment day. Marcus Thorne's law office was exactly what you'd expect. Walls of mahogany bookshelves filled with leather-bound books that had probably never been opened. A thick carpet that muffled all sound. An air of quiet, expensive power. It was designed to intimidate. We were shown into a conference room. Mr. Thorne was already there, a slick, silver-haired man with the predatory smile of a shark. And with him, Dr. Alistair Finch, looking uncomfortable and out of place. He wouldn't meet my eyes. We all took our seats around the large conference table. I was seated between Eleanor and Derek, a prisoner between her guards. Buster lay dutifully at my feet, a silent observer. Mr. Thorne began, his voice smooth as silk. "Thank you all for coming. This is, of course, a difficult and sensitive matter. We are here today to finalize the petition for a temporary conservatorship for Miss Clara Reed, for her own health and safety." He slid a thick stack of papers across the table. "Eleanor, as her mother and next of kin, you will be the primary conservator. Derek, you will be co-conservator." My mother launched into her speech. Tears welled in her eyes as she described my terrifying decline. She spoke of my memory loss, my paranoid delusions, my inability to care for myself. She even referenced the fake journal, which she produced from her handbag and pushed towards the lawyer. "It's all in here," she wept. "Every episode. It's been a nightmare." Derek chimed in, talking about how I was a danger to myself, how they were terrified I would wander off or burn the house down. It was a symphony of lies, beautifully orchestrated and delivered with heartbreaking sincerity. Dr. Finch then gave his professional opinion. He spoke in clinical, detached terms about my diagnosis. Early onset schizoaffective disorder, inherited from my paternal line. He recommended immediate inpatient treatment and confirmed that, in his medical opinion, I was gravely disabled and incapable of managing my own affairs or making my own medical decisions. It was done. They had built the case, brick by damning brick. Mr. Thorne slid the final signature page in front of me, alongside a pen. "Clara," he said, his voice softening with false sympathy. "This is just to acknowledge that you understand the proceedings. It's for the best." This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. Derek, unable to contain his vindictive glee, added one final twist of the knife. "And we need to address the issue of the dog," he said, looking at Thorne. "As part of the conservatorship, we'll be assuming responsibility for all of her assets and property. Given her instability, we don't believe it's safe for her to be around an animal. She could harm it. We plan to surrender him to a proper care facility." To be euthanized. That's what he meant. My blood turned to ice. I looked at them. At my mother, the picture of sorrow. At Derek, his face alight with cruelty. At the doctor who had sold his oath for a payday. At the lawyer who was greasing the wheels of their theft. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I took a slow, deep breath. And then I spoke. My voice was low, clear, and steady. It was a voice they hadn't heard in 2 years, and it hit the silent room with the force of a physical blow. "No." Every head snapped towards me. Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. Derek's smug smile faltered. "I don't think so," I said, and I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the tiny black recorder and placed it gently on the polished table. Then I looked at Mr. Thorne. "Before we sign anything," I said, my voice ringing with a power I didn't know I possessed, "I have an audio file I believe the entire room needs to hear. It's a recording of a phone call between my mother and Dr. Finch." The silence in the room was absolute. It was so thick you could have carved it with a knife. The 4 of them, my mother, my brother, the doctor, and the lawyer, stared at the small black object on the table as if it were a venomous snake. Dr. Finch's face, which had been a carefully neutral mask, instantly turned the color of ash. Eleanor's jaw went slack, her performance of the grieving mother evaporating in a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. "What is this, Clara?" Mr. Thorne, the lawyer, finally managed to ask, his voice losing its silken edge. "What kind of stunt are you trying to pull?" "It's not a stunt," I said calmly. I pressed a small button on the side of the device. A tiny LED light flickered on. "It's evidence." I had the file queued up. I didn't need to say another word. I simply pressed play. Dr. Finch's tinny, nervous voice filled the opulent conference room. "Eleanor, you have to be careful. The board is doing random audits this quarter. My neck is on the line here." The color drained completely from Eleanor's face. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Derek's eyes darted between me, the recorder, and the door, like a cornered rat looking for an escape. The recording continued. "The medication I'm giving her, it's a mild antipsychotic, designed to cause confusion and lethargy. There's no physical way it would produce the schizophrenic symptoms you're describing in your journal. You need to stick to the cognitive decline angle. Mr. Thorne's professional composure shattered. He shot a look of pure fury at Dr. Finch, who looked like he was about to vomit. The doctor had just confessed, on tape, to medical malpractice, conspiracy, and fraud. His career was over. And then came my mother's voice, purring and confident. "Don't you worry about me, Alistair. I know how to handle myself. You just make sure your report is convincing. $5 million is a lot of money. Clara's life is at stake." I pressed the stop button. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, more damning than the recording itself. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then Dr. Finch made a break for it. He shot up from his chair so quickly it squealed against the floor, and he scrambled for the door. "Alistair, don't you dare!" my mother shrieked, her voice no longer soft and grieving, but the shrill, ugly screech of a harpy. But he was gone. He had chosen self-preservation, leaving them to face the fallout. Mr. Thorne, the lawyer, stood up slowly. He looked at my mother and Derek with a contempt so profound it was terrifying. He was a shark, yes, but he was a shark who had just realized his clients had painted a target on his own back by involving him in their criminal conspiracy. "Get out," he said, his voice a low growl. "Get out of my office. Now." "Marcus, we had a deal," Derek blustered, trying to sound tough, but his voice trembled. "We have no deal. We have never met. Your retainer will be refunded, and my firm will be issuing a statement. Get out." Eleanor turned her fury on me. Her face was a twisted mask of hate. You little bitch," she hissed, lunging across the table. "How could you do this to your own mother?" She never reached me. A deep, rumbling growl echoed from under the table. Buster rose to his feet, not aggressively but planting himself firmly between me and her, a solid wall of protective muscle. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. The message was clear. The growl was a promise. They froze. My mother looked at the dog, then back at me, and for the first time, she saw me. Not the fragile daughter, not the piggy bank, but the woman who had outplayed her at her own game. I stood up, my legs feeling steadier than they had in years. I picked up the recorder and the pile of conservatorship papers. I walked to the end of the table and began to tear them in half, then in quarters, letting the pieces flutter down onto the expensive carpet like confetti at a funeral. "This is over," I said, my voice even. "This meeting is over. Your control over me is over. And you are going to pay for what you did." I looked at Derek. "You wanted to sell my car? You wanted to surrender my dog?" I looked at my mother. "You wanted to lock me in an institution and steal my father's legacy?" I pulled out my brand new, unregistered burner phone, which I had hidden in my shoe. I had activated it that morning. I dialed 3 numbers. 911. "Yes," I said into the phone, my voice clear and strong as I stared directly into my mother's horrified eyes. "I'd like to report a crime in progress. Conspiracy to commit fraud, false imprisonment, and attempted kidnapping. Yes, I have evidence. I'm at the law offices of Marcus Thorne. And the suspects, they're still here with me." I ended the call. Then I sat back down in my chair, reached under the table, and stroked Buster's head. He licked my hand. Outside, in the distance, I could hear the first faint sound of approaching sirens. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of my own rescue. And I had called it in myself. The wail of the sirens grew from a distant cry to an undeniable street-shaking roar. In the suffocating silence of that conference room, it was the sound of a new world being born. Eleanor stood frozen, her face a grotesque collage of fury and disbelief. Derek, who had always fancied himself a tough guy, looked small and terrified. He was no longer a predator. He was just a boy who had been caught with his hand in a cookie jar worth millions of dollars. Two uniformed officers appeared in the doorway, their presence immediately filling the room with an authority that dwarfed the superficial power of the mahogany and leather. A third officer, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor, stepped in behind them. She took in the scene with a quick, sweeping glance. The torn papers on the floor, my mother's enraged posture, my own deliberate calm, and the large, watchful dog at my side. "We received a 911 call reporting a possible kidnapping and fraud," she said, her voice even, but carrying a weight that demanded a real answer. Her eyes settled on me. "I made that call," I said, my voice not wavering. "My name is Clara Reed. This is my mother, Eleanor, and my stepbrother, Derek." Eleanor finally found her voice, a shrieking, hysterical sound that was a stark contrast to her earlier performance. "This is a misunderstanding. It's a family matter. My daughter, she's not well. She's having one of her episodes." The female officer, her name tag read Detective Harding, didn't even look at Eleanor. She kept her eyes on me. "Ma'am, are you here of your own free will?" "I am now," I said. "For the last 2 weeks, I have been held against my will in a locked room in my mother's house. For the last 2 years, they have been deliberately poisoning me with incorrect medication, supplied by a Dr. Alistair Finch, in order to have me declared mentally incompetent before my 30th birthday." I gestured with my head toward the recorder still sitting on the table. "This device contains audio evidence of their conspiracy, including a confession from the doctor himself. They brought me here today to sign a conservatorship petition that would give them full control of an inheritance my father left me." Detective Harding absorbed this without a flicker of surprise, as if she heard stories like this every day. Perhaps she did. She nodded to one of the male officers. "Please secure the device." As the officer reached for the recorder, Derek lunged. It was a stupid, desperate move. "You're not taking that!" he yelled. He never got close. The second officer moved with a speed that was startling, intercepting him and slamming him against the wall with a sickening thud. "Police, do not resist," the officer barked. In seconds, Derek's hands were cuffed behind his back, his face pressed into a large, framed painting of a ship at sea. The tough guy act had dissolved into pathetic, blubbering sobs. Eleanor let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a gasp. She turned to me, her eyes wild with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful in its intensity. "You have destroyed this family. After everything I've done for you, you ungrateful little monster. I wish you had never been born." The words, which would have shattered me a month ago, now felt like nothing more than noise. They were the desperate, empty threats of a queen whose castle was crumbling around her. Detective Harding simply stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. As the other officer pulled out a second pair of cuffs, my mother completely fell apart. Her body went limp, and she started wailing, a theatrical, self-pitying sound. "My baby! They're taking my baby boy!" she cried, looking at Derek. They were cuffed and read their rights, right there in the conference room that was meant to be the site of my undoing. They were searched, their faces a mixture of humiliation and shock. As they were let out, Eleanor's eyes met mine one last time. There was no remorse, no sadness. There was only the cold, hard promise of revenge. Detective Harding stayed behind. She looked from the cowering lawyer Thorne to me. "Mr. Thorne, I imagine will be having a long chat with you as well. Do not leave the city." She then turned to me, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Reed, I know this is a lot to process. Would you be willing to come down to the station to give a formal statement?" I reached down and clipped Buster's leash onto his collar. I stood up tall. "Yes," I said. "I've been waiting to tell my story for a very long time." As I walked out of that office, with Buster trotting proudly beside me, I passed the conference room window. I could see them, my mother and my brother, being placed into the back of separate squad cars. The flashing red and blue lights washed over their faces, painting them in the colors of their own downfall. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt quiet. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the war is over. The fighting was done. Now, the long, slow work of surveying the damage and rebuilding was about to begin. The police station was a world away from the hushed, expensive corridors of the law firm. It smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaner, and a low-grade, simmering tension. The lighting was fluorescent and unforgiving, stripping away all pretense. It was the perfect place to tell the truth. Detective Harding led me to a small, private interview room. It was bare bones, a metal table, a few uncomfortable chairs, and a one-way mirror on the wall. Buster, who had been granted access as my official service animal, settled under the table, his presence a warm, solid anchor in the sterile environment. He seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, staying quiet and observant. "Can I get you some water? Coffee?" Harding asked. Her professionalism was a balm. She wasn't pitying me or treating me like a fragile piece of glass. She was treating me like a witness, a credible source. After 2 years of being treated like a child, it was intoxicating. "Water would be great, thank you," I said. For the next 4 hours, I talked. I told her everything, starting with the letter about the trust fund and ending with the bolt sliding shut on the attic door. I spoke with a clarity and precision that surprised even myself. The fog had lifted so completely that the events of the past 2 years were laid out in my mind like a timeline in a history book. I detailed the gaslighting, the lost mug, the forgotten appointments. I explained the change in my medication and the cognitive decline it induced. I described how Buster's training had been the first clue that something was wrong, how his physiological honesty had cut through their psychological warfare. Harding listened patiently, taking meticulous notes. She had a knack for asking the right questions, ones that drew out details I hadn't even realized were important. "When they locked you in the attic," she asked, "did they provide adequate food and water? Was there a functioning bathroom?" Her questions were clinical, focused. She was building a case, not just for fraud, but for felony false imprisonment. When I finished, I was emotionally exhausted, but I also felt lighter than I had in years. The story was no longer a poison I was holding inside me. It was out. It was real. It was on the record. The most crucial part came when another officer brought in the micro recorder. They had a technician listen to the files in another room. Detective Harding and I sat in silence for about 20 minutes. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of the recordings through the wall. I could hear my mother's voice, Dr. Finch's voice, Derek's voice, all the ghosts that had haunted my waking nightmares. When Harding came back into the room, her face was set like granite. "Miss Reed," she said, her voice low and serious, "what you have endured is horrific. And the evidence you provided? It's ironclad. The district attorney is going to have a field day with this." She told me they had already run Dr. Finch's name. He had 2 prior complaints filed against him with the state medical board, both for over-prescribing medications, but they had been dismissed for lack of evidence. "Your recording changes everything for him," she said. "We've already issued a BOLO. Be on the lookout for him. He won't get far." She explained what would happen next. Eleanor and Derek would be arraigned. Bail would likely be denied, given the flight risk and the severity of the charges. A restraining order would be put in place immediately, forbidding them or anyone acting on their behalf from contacting me. "You're going to need a good lawyer," she advised. "Not for the criminal case, the state will handle that, but for the civil side. To formally block the conservatorship and secure your assets. Do you have someone?" I shook my head. "No. They isolated me. I don't even have my own phone." Harding nodded, pulled a card from her wallet, and wrote a name and number on the back. "This is a woman I trust. She specializes in cases of financial and psychological abuse. Tell her I sent you." As I stood to leave, she put a hand gently on my arm. "You're very strong, Clara," she said, her professional mask slipping for just a second. "Most people would have broken." I looked down at the big yellow dog leaning against my leg. "I had help," I said. Walking out of the police station and into the late afternoon sun felt like stepping onto a new planet. The air smelled cleaner, the colors seemed brighter. I took a deep breath, the first truly deep breath I'd taken in 2 years. It was the breath of a free woman. I had a long road ahead, but for the first time, it was my road, and I wouldn't be walking it alone. Detective Harding had an officer drive me home. Pulling up to the curb of the old Victorian house was one of the strangest experiences of my life. Just that morning, it had been my prison. Now it was a crime scene. A strip of yellow police tape was stretched across the front door. The officer removed the tape for me. "The house has been cleared," he said. "It's all yours. If you need anything, and I mean anything at all, you call us." I stepped inside. The house was silent, deathly silent. The air was thick with the residue of anger and fear. It smelled like my mother's perfume and Derek's stale cigarette smoke. It smelled like betrayal. Buster walked in ahead of me, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. He did a quick sweep of the downstairs, sniffing every corner, as if to make sure the monsters were truly gone. Then he came and sat by my side, looking up at me expectantly. My first stop was the kitchen. I opened the pantry and found the bottle of pills Dr. Finch had prescribed, tucked away behind a box of cereal. I stared at the small white tablets that had stolen months of my life. Without a second thought, I dumped them into the trash can and then took the bag out to the curb. It was a small, symbolic act of reclamation. Then, I did something I hadn't been allowed to do for weeks. I walked through my own home. I went into the living room, where they had plotted against me. I went into Derek's room, a mess of dirty clothes and empty energy drink cans, a testament to his wasted life. I went into my mother's room, a pristine, perfectly curated space that belied the ugliness of her soul. Finally, I climbed the stairs to the attic. The bolt on the outside of the door looked obscene in the light of day. It was a stark, ugly piece of hardware that screamed of imprisonment. I opened the door and looked inside the dusty, hot room where I had spent the last weeks of my captivity. The mattress was on the floor. The empty food trays were stacked in a corner. The scratch marks I'd made on the wall to count the days were a silent testament to my ordeal. I didn't feel scared. I just felt an immense, overwhelming sadness. Sadness for the woman who had been so lost and terrified in this room. Sadness for the mother I thought I had, the one who would have protected me, not imprisoned me. I closed the door and walked back down the stairs to my actual bedroom. It was just as I had left it, but it felt foreign. I ran a hot bath, filling it with lavender salts I found in the back of the cabinet. As I soaked in the steaming water, the tension of the last 2 years began to seep out of my bones. I cried. Not the hysterical, panicked sobs of the past, but quiet, grieving tears. I cried for the time I had lost, for the trust that had been annihilated, and for the family that had never really been a family at all. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I slept in my own bed. The sheets were clean and cool. The room was quiet. I left the door open. Buster, instead of sleeping at the foot of the bed, hopped up and curled his large body right next to me. his head resting on the adjacent pillow. He seemed to know that tonight I needed him closer than ever. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. But in the middle of the night, a sound woke me. It was the phantom echo of a metal bolt sliding shut. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering, my body drenched in a cold sweat. The room was dark and unfamiliar. For a terrifying second, I thought I was back in the attic. Then, I felt a heavy weight on my chest. Buster had woken up with me and was performing his DPT task, pressing me back into the mattress, back into reality. I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his warm fur. "It's okay," I whispered, to him and to myself. "We're safe. We're free." I knew then that the fight wasn't completely over. They were in jail, but the prison they had built in my mind would take much longer to dismantle. The phantom sounds, the reflexive fear, those were the ghosts I would have to learn to live with. But as I lay there in the dark, with my loyal friend protecting me from my own memories, I knew I would not be facing them alone. The house was haunted, but I was no longer its ghost. The next morning, I woke with a singular purpose. The fog was gone, the immediate crisis was over, and now it was time to move from defense to offense. The first call I made was to the lawyer Detective Harding had recommended, a woman named Patricia Evans. I used the old landline in the kitchen, a relic I was suddenly grateful for. When I explained who I was and who had referred me, I was put through to her immediately. Her voice was calm, no nonsense, and radiated competence. "Detective Harding called me last night," she said, getting straight to the point. She gave me the broad strokes. "What your mother and stepbrother attempted to do is not only morally reprehensible, it's a Class C felony. I want you to come to my office this afternoon. And bring your dog." Her office was the antithesis of Marcus Thorne's. It was bright, modern, and filled with plants. Patricia Evans herself was a woman in her 50s, with a sharp, tailored suit and an even sharper mind. She greeted Buster with a warm smile and a biscuit from a jar on her desk before turning her full attention to me. For the second time in 2 days, I told my story. But this time it was different. I wasn't just a witness recounting a crime. I was a client building a case. Patricia listened, her pen flying across a legal pad. She had a way of asking questions that cut right to the heart of the matter. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. "Clara," she said, her voice firm, "from a legal standpoint, you are in an incredibly strong position. Your evidence is overwhelming. The first thing we are going to do is file an emergency restraining order, a permanent one. They will not be able to contact you, come within 500 feet of you, or attempt to access any of your financial or medical information for the rest of their lives." A weight I didn't even know I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. "Second," she continued, "we will file a civil lawsuit against them and against Dr. Alistair Finch. We will sue for damages related to false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, medical malpractice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. We are going to strip them of every asset they have. This isn't about the money for you, I know, but it's about ensuring they can never, ever do this to anyone else again." She explained that while the district attorney's office would prosecute the criminal case, our civil suit would run in parallel. The goal was to protect me and my assets and to seek justice for the psychological and emotional trauma I had endured. "We will also be petitioning the court to have your mother formally removed as the trustee of your father's estate, effective immediately," she added. Apparently, even though I didn't have control of the principal, Eleanor had been the named trustee, managing the disbursements for my living expenses. A fact she had conveniently never told me. It was a detail that made her betrayal even more chilling. Over the next few hours, we worked. I signed papers. I gave her a detailed list of every incident of gaslighting I could remember. I gave her the contact information for the organization that had trained Buster. as his trainer's testimony about his specific skills would be invaluable in court. As I was getting ready to leave, Patricia stopped me. "One more thing, Clara. The house. I know there are memories there. We need to have a security company come and change every lock, install a modern alarm system, and do a full sweep. Today."
You are not spending another night in that house until it is a fortress. It was the most practical, reassuring advice I could have received. It was an acknowledgement of my fear and a concrete plan to conquer it. That afternoon, a team from a security company descended on the house. They changed the locks, installed deadbolts, and put in a state-of-the-art alarm system with cameras. They were professional, respectful, and efficient. That evening, as I locked my new front door with a key that only I possessed, I felt a profound shift. For years, I had been a pawn in someone else's game. I had been acted upon, manipulated, and controlled. But today, sitting in that bright office, making strategic decisions, hiring a lawyer, and securing my home, I had become a player. It was my name on the lawsuit. It was my hand signing the papers. It was my voice giving the orders. They had tried to take my power, my money, and my mind. But they had failed. And now, I was going to use everything my father had left me, his fortune, my own resilience, and the help of a few good people, to build a future on the ashes of their greed. The game had changed. And for the first time, I was holding all the cards. In a small town, a story like mine doesn't just spread. It detonates. The arrest of Eleanor and Derek Reed at a high-profile law firm was a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the community's quiet, well-manicured existence. My mother had spent decades cultivating an image of a graceful, devoted single parent, a pillar of the local charity circuit. Derek was known as a bit of a troublemaker, but he was shielded by her carefully crafted reputation. The truth, when it came out in whispers and then in a short, factual article in the local paper, was far more scandalous than anyone could have imagined. "Local woman and son arrested on charges of fraud, false imprisonment," the headline read. The article was sparse on details, mentioning an inheritance and a dispute, but it was enough to ignite a firestorm of gossip. The first few days, I stayed inside. The newly secured house felt like a sanctuary. Patricia, my lawyer, had warned me that there would be fallout, and she was right. I saw a local news van drive slowly past my house. My landline rang constantly with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, which I let go to voicemail. They were reporters, of course, vultures smelling a story. But then something else started to happen. The community that I thought would judge or disbelieve me began to show a different side. It started with a casserole. I heard a knock on my new front door and looked through the peephole to see Mrs. Gable from across the street. She was the very neighbor I had overheard my mother lying to, the one Eleanor had fed the story about my father's side of the family. I opened the door cautiously. She stood there holding a large Pyrex dish, covered in aluminum foil. Her face was full of a kindness that was so genuine, it almost made me cry. "I'm not going to bother you, Clara," she said softly. I read the paper, and I wanted to say I am so sorry for what you've been through and for believing what I was told. She thrust the dish into my hands. "It's macaroni and cheese. It's not much, but I find it helps." She didn't ask for details. She didn't pry. She just offered a quiet act of solidarity. And in that moment, I understood that the narrative was no longer being controlled by my mother. The truth was out, and people were choosing to believe me. After that, the floodgates opened. People I barely knew would stop me if I ventured out to the grocery store. Not to gossip, but to offer a quiet word of support. "We're thinking of you, Clara. You're so brave." The mailman left a chocolate bar in my mailbox with a note that just said, "Hang in there." The shame and humiliation my mother had tried to heap upon me had boomeranged back onto her with devastating force. I heard through the grapevine that the charity board she chaired had called an emergency meeting and voted to remove her. Her picture was quietly taken down from the wall at the country club. She had built her entire world on a foundation of image and reputation, and overnight, that world had ceased to exist. In a town where what people thought of you was everything, she had become a pariah. Derek's downfall was less spectacular but just as complete. His gambling buddies and fair-weather friends disappeared into the woodwork. The story of his arrest, of him being slammed against a wall while trying to steal from his mentally ill stepsister, made him a local laughingstock. He was no longer a charming rogue. He was a pathetic, cruel leech. Of course, not everyone was supportive. I received a few anonymous, hateful letters in the mail, likely from Eleanor's few remaining loyalists, calling me a liar and an ungrateful daughter. But their venom was drowned out by the overwhelming wave of quiet support from the rest of the community. The most profound moment came about a week after the arrest. I was in the yard with Buster when a car pulled up. It was my mother's best friend, a woman named Carol, who had been like a second aunt to me my whole life. She got out of the car and just stood on the sidewalk looking at me. Her face was pale. "I called the jail," she said, her voice shaking. "I talked to her. She told me you set her up, that you faked everything to steal her money." Carol looked me right in the eye. And for 1 second, I almost believed her. Because the Eleanor I know would never do something so monstrous. She took a deep breath. But then I remembered the real Eleanor. The one who would subtly belittle her friends to make herself look better. The one whose love always felt conditional. And I knew you were telling the truth. She started to cry. "I am so sorry, Clara. I should have seen it. I should have done something." "It's not your fault," I said, and I meant it. My mother had fooled everyone. We stood there for a long time, two women on opposite sides of a lawn, connected by a betrayal that had scarred us both. The community had seen the real story, and they had passed their own judgment, one far swifter and more absolute than any court of law. My mother and brother hadn't just lost their freedom, they had lost their place in the world. And I, who had been an outcast in my own home, was finally being welcomed back into the fold. My 30th birthday arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a new beginning. There was no party, no grand celebration. Instead, the day was marked by two significant, life-altering events. The first was a meeting at Patricia Evans's office. I walked in just a week after my birthday, feeling the strange, momentous weight of the date. 30. The age my father had designated as the dawn of my independence. Patricia greeted me with a warm smile and a thick file folder. "Happy birthday, Clara," she said. Or, as we say in the legal world, congratulations on reaching the age of majority for the purposes of your trust. She explained that with my mother's arrest, the process of removing her as trustee had been expedited. The court had appointed a temporary, neutral third party to oversee the trust for the past few weeks. But today, that all changed. She slid a document across the desk. It was the final transfer of control. All the legal jargon boiled down to one simple, staggering fact. The Michael Reed Trust, with all its assets, holdings, and capital, was now mine. Completely and unconditionally. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. This was a different signature, a different pen, a different life from the one I had almost signed away in that other lawyer's office just a few short weeks ago. This signature wasn't an act of surrender. It was an act of profound and total liberation. I signed my name, Clara Reed, and in that moment, I felt the full weight of my father's legacy settle onto my shoulders. It was a bittersweet feeling. I had the money, the freedom he had always intended for me. But I had ached for a father my whole life, and now that I finally had this monumental connection to him, he was gone. I found myself wondering what he was like. Did he know my mother was capable of such cruelty? Was this stipulation, this 30-year wait, his way of protecting me from a danger he had foreseen but couldn't name? I would never know. But I felt a surge of gratitude for his foresight. He had, in his own way, saved me from beyond the grave. Patricia let me have a quiet moment with my thoughts before she spoke again.
The first thing we need to do, she said gently, is hire a reputable wealth management firm. This isn't just a bank account, Clara. It's a significant portfolio. It needs to be managed wisely. We spent the rest of the morning discussing financial advisors and long-term strategies. It was surreal. Just a month ago, my biggest financial decision was whether I could afford the brand name coffee. Now I was discussing stocks, bonds, and philanthropic endowments. The second event of the day was quieter, but no less significant. When I got home, I took Buster for a long walk in the park. It was a beautiful autumn day, the leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold. As we walked, I thought about the sheer unlikelihood of it all. How a dog, a creature of pure instinct and loyalty, had become the key that unlocked my prison. He didn't know about trust funds or conservatorships. He just knew my scent, my heartbeat, the chemical signals of my distress, and his honest, unwavering response to those signals had been my North Star in the disorienting fog of their lies. I sat on a bench while he chased a squirrel, his tail wagging with an uncomplicated joy that felt like a lesson in itself. I realized then that my father had left me two legacies. The first was the financial freedom that would allow me to build any life I wanted. The second, and perhaps more important, was the circumstances that had led me to Buster. The money would give me security, but the dog had given me back my soul. When we got back home, a package was waiting on my doorstep. It was from the P.O. box I had set up. Inside was the thumb drive of evidence I had mailed to myself weeks ago, a relic from a war that was already over. Tucked into the package was a small, clumsily wrapped box. I opened it. It was a simple silver locket, a birthday gift I had bought for myself online during one of my late-night planning sessions, a small promise of a future I wasn't sure I would get to see. I opened the locket. On one side, I would put the only picture I had of my father, a faded photo of a young man with kind eyes. On the other side, I would put a picture of Buster. I was 30 years old. I was an orphan. I was a survivor. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly, and blessedly whole. The past was a scar, but the future was a clean, blank page, and I was finally free to write my own story. The first phone call from jail came 2 weeks after my birthday. The caller ID on the landline flashed up as County Detention Center. My heart leaped into my throat. For a second, the old, reflexive fear kicked in. Part of me wanted to just let it ring. But Patricia, my lawyer, had been clear. Don't engage, don't argue, but listen. Anything they say can be used against them. I took a breath, steeled myself, and answered. A recorded voice announced I had a collect call from an inmate. I pressed 1 to accept. Clara? Clarabelle, is that you? It was my mother's voice, but it was different. All the polish was gone. It was raw, ragged, and trembling. I'm here, I said, my own voice flat and emotionless. Oh, thank God, she sobbed. Clara, you have to help me. You have to tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Your brother, he's not doing well in here. He's terrified. This place is horrible. It's cold and the food is inedible. I listened in stunned silence. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what she had done. She had gone straight from plotting my destruction to pleading for my help, as if the events in the lawyer's office had been nothing more than a minor family tiff. The sheer narcissistic audacity of it was breathtaking. You're my daughter,
she continued, her voice gaining a wheedling, manipulative tone. A daughter is supposed to love her mother, to forgive her. We can put all this behind us. You can drop the charges. We can be a family again. A family? I finally said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. You locked me in an attic. You tried to have me declared insane to steal my money. That's not what a family does. Her tone shifted instantly from pathetic to venomous. After everything I sacrificed for you, I gave you a home. I clothed you. I put a roof over your head. You were always a difficult, ungrateful child, just like your father. This is all his fault. That money, it poisoned you. It was a masterclass in deflection and blame shifting. In her mind, she was the victim. I was the aggressor. The money was the villain. She had constructed a narrative in which she was completely blameless, a long-suffering mother betrayed by a greedy, unstable daughter. The money didn't poison me, Eleanor, I said, using her first name for the first time in my life. The word felt powerful, final. Your greed poisoned you. You did this to yourself. And to Derek. Don't you dare talk about your brother, she shrieked. He did all of this for me, to protect me. The lie was so absurd, so transparent, that I almost laughed. He did it for his gambling debts, and you know it. I have the recordings, remember? There was a sputtering silence on the other end of the line. Then a click, followed by the dial tone. She had hung up. I stood in the quiet kitchen, my hand still on the receiver. The call hadn't shaken me the way I thought it would. Instead, it had solidified my resolve. Any lingering residual guilt I might have felt, any misplaced sense of filial duty, had been utterly incinerated by that conversation. She wasn't sorry. She would never be sorry. She was only sorry she got caught. A week later, a letter arrived. It was from Derek, the handwriting a childish scrawl on cheap, lined paper. It was full of misspellings and self-pity. He wrote about how unfair it all was, how he had just been trying to help Mom out. He said he missed me and Buster. He said if I got him out, he would pay me back every penny. He promised. It was the pathetic, desperate plea of a born con man who had finally run out of marks. I didn't even bother to finish reading it. I handed both the letter and the recording of my mother's call over to Patricia. That was the last time I heard from either of them directly. Their attempts at manipulation had failed, and in doing so, had only tightened the legal noose around their own necks. Patricia informed me that my mother's phone call, in which she admitted to knowing about the plan, was considered another nail in her legal coffin. They had tried to reach across the prison walls and pull me back into their toxic orbit. But the bars of their cage were real, and the walls I had built around my own life were now stronger than steel. I was free, and I was finally, completely done. With the legal machinery grinding forward and the lines of communication with my former family severed, the adrenaline that had fueled me for weeks began to subside. In its place, a deep, profound exhaustion set in. The battle was won, but the wounds of the war were still fresh. I was sleeping through the night, but I'd wake up with my jaw clenched, my shoulders aching with a tension that never seemed to leave. Detective Harding's words came back to me. Most people would have broken. I hadn't broken, but I was certainly cracked. I knew that if I didn't deal with the psychological trauma of the past 2 years, it would haunt me forever. The ghosts of the attic would follow me into any new house I bought. The first step was finding a therapist. The idea was terrifying. My last experience with a mental health professional had been with a man who had taken a bribe to destroy my life. Trusting another one felt like an impossible leap of faith. But Patricia, my ever-practical lawyer, had a recommendation. Dr. Anya Sharma, she'd said. She's tough, she's brilliant, and she has a zero-tolerance policy for bullshit. She's perfect for you. My first session with Dr. Sharma was nerve-wracking. She was a woman in her 60s with kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. I brought Buster with me, a silent, furry security blanket. I sat in her comfortable office and, for the third time, told my story. But this was the hardest telling of all. This wasn't for a police report or a legal case. This was for me. As I spoke, the emotions I had suppressed in the service of survival came rushing to the surface. I cried for the mother I had lost, the one I realized had probably never existed in the first place. I raged against the casual cruelty of their betrayal. I admitted for the first time out loud how close I had come to believing them, how deeply their gaslighting had penetrated my sense of self. Dr. Sharma didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. She just listened. When I was done, she looked at me and said something I will never forget. "Clara, what they did to you was a form of psychological torture. You survived. Your only job now is to learn how to live again." Therapy became my second front line. We worked on dismantling the architecture of their abuse. We talked about boundaries, about the reflexive guilt that had been programmed into me since childhood. She gave me tools to deal with the panic that still ambushed me in quiet moments. She helped me understand that the hypervigilance that kept me on edge wasn't a flaw. It was a survival mechanism that I no longer needed. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to heal. I also started reconnecting with the outside world. I found an old address book and called a friend from college, a woman named Sarah whom I had drifted away from under the fog of my illness. When she heard my voice, she burst into tears. "Clara! Oh my God, I've been so worried," she exclaimed. "I tried calling, but your number was disconnected. I even called your mother a few months ago, and she told me you were traveling indefinitely." She made it sound so mysterious and sad. I knew something was wrong. My mother's lies had extended further than I had ever imagined. She had been systematically erasing me from my own life. Sarah and I met for coffee the next day. I told her the whole story. She listened, her expression shifting from disbelief to horror to furious indignation on my behalf. "That woman isn't a mother. She's a monster," she said, her hand covering mine on the table. It felt so good to have a friend again, to talk about normal things, to laugh. It was like finding a forgotten part of myself. Between therapy sessions and reconnecting with friends, I began to feel the first stirrings of a future. The gaping wound of my family's betrayal was still there, but it was no longer the defining feature of my existence. It was becoming a part of my story, not the whole story. One afternoon, Dr. Sharma asked me what I wanted to do now. With the trust fund, my options were limitless. I could travel, go back to school, do anything. I thought for a moment. "I want to do something that matters," I said. "Something that honors the fight." I looked down at Buster, who was snoozing at my feet. They tried to use my mind against me. And a dog, a creature of pure, honest instinct, saved me. I think I want to do something with that. A new idea, the first truly joyful and exciting idea I'd had in years, began to take root. It was a future I would build myself, not one that was left to me. And it would be a future where the very thing that saved me could be used to save others. The healing was far from over. But for the first time, I could see the road ahead, and it was leading somewhere beautiful. The legal process, unlike the swift judgment of the community, moved at a glacial pace. Months were consumed by pre-trial motions, depositions, and legal wrangling. But with every step, the case against my mother and brother grew stronger, and their situation became more hopeless. Dr. Alistair Finch was the first domino to fall, and he fell hard. He had been apprehended 2 states over, trying to cross the border into Canada with a suitcase full of cash. Faced with the irrefutable audio evidence and the prospect of a long prison sentence, he'd made a deal with the district attorney. He agreed to plead guilty to medical malpractice and conspiracy and to testify against Eleanor and Derek in exchange for a lighter sentence. His medical license was permanently revoked, and his reputation was left in tatters. His betrayal of me had ultimately led to his own self-destruction. Patricia Evans, my lawyer, kept me updated on every development. She informed me that the DA was pursuing the maximum charges possible. Because my isolation in the attic involved cutting off my communication and holding me for the purpose of committing a felony, fraud, the charge was elevated beyond simple false imprisonment. They were being charged with kidnapping. Bail was, as predicted, denied. The judge deemed them a flight risk and a potential danger to me. So they remained in the county jail, their world shrinking to the size of a small cell, while mine expanded every day. The evidence I had collected was so comprehensive that Derek's court-appointed lawyer advised him to take a plea deal. Faced with the recordings of his own voice plotting to sell my car and dispose of my dog, he had no defense. He pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommendation of a lesser sentence than his mother. It was a classic act of self-preservation, throwing her under the bus to save himself a few years in a state prison. My mother, however, refused to surrender. In her mind, she was a wronged matriarch, a victim of a conspiracy between me, the doctor, and her own treacherous son. She fired her public defender and used the last of her savings to hire a bulldog of a defense attorney who tried every trick in the book. He filed motions to have my audio recordings thrown out, claiming they were an illegal wiretap. The motion was denied, as the conversations were recorded in a common area of the house where there was no reasonable expectation of privacy. He tried to have me subpoenaed for a psychiatric evaluation. The motion was laughed out of court. Her trial was set. I would have to testify. The thought filled me with a familiar dread, but it was a feeling I now had the tools to manage. Dr. Sharma and I spent weeks preparing. We did mock cross-examinations, with her playing the part of the aggressive defense attorney. She taught me how to stay calm, to stick to the facts, and not to let him bait me into an emotional reaction. "He will try to paint you as an unstable, vindictive daughter," she warned me. "He will bring up your history of migraines. He will try to make you look like a liar. Your only weapon is the truth. Just tell your story, calmly and clearly. The jury will see it." A week before the trial was set to begin, a surprising offer came through. My mother's lawyer, likely realizing his client's case was unwinnable and that her testimony would be a train wreck, offered a plea deal. She would plead guilty to all charges, sparing us both the ordeal of a public trial. Patricia and I discussed it at length. Part of me wanted to see her on the stand, forced to answer for her crimes in front of a jury of her peers. But a larger part of me was ready for it to be over. A trial would mean weeks of media attention, of having my trauma picked apart in a public forum. "It's your decision, Clara," Patricia said. "But a guilty plea is a win. It's a full admission of what she did." I agreed. I didn't need the spectacle of a trial to validate my experience. I had my life back. I had my sanity. That was victory enough. The sentencing was scheduled for a month later. Derek and Eleanor would be sentenced on the same day. The long, dark chapter of my legal battle was finally drawing to a close. Now, all that was left was to turn the page and start writing the next one. And I knew exactly what the first sentence would be. The day after my mother accepted the plea deal, I put the house up for sale. It wasn't a difficult decision. The new locks and security system had made it a fortress, but it was still a fortress full of ghosts. I'd walk past the attic stairs and feel a phantom chill. I'd sit in the living room and hear the echo of their scheming voices. The house wasn't a home. It was a museum of my own trauma, and I was ready to stop paying the admission fee. Because of the notoriety of the case, the sale was quick. A wealthy couple from the city, intrigued by the home's Victorian architecture and sordid history, bought it in cash for well over the asking price. I sold it fully furnished, wanting to take nothing with me but my clothes, my books, and my dog. The process of leaving was a strange mix of grief and liberation. As I packed my personal belongings into boxes, I found old photo albums, pictures of a younger me, a smiling child sitting on my mother's lap, a family trip to the beach, with Derek making a funny face at the camera. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for the family I thought we were, for the love I had believed was real. I had to remind myself that these photos were props from a play, and I had been the only one who didn't know it was a performance. I closed the albums and left them in the attic for the new owners to find. My last night in the house, I ordered pizza and ate it on the floor of my empty bedroom with Buster. The rooms echoed with a profound emptiness that was no longer frightening, but peaceful. It was a blank slate. Finding a new home was a joyful, empowering experience. I wasn't looking for a mansion. I was looking for light, for peace, for a place that felt safe in its bones. I found it in a modern, light-filled townhouse on the other side of the county, in a quiet neighborhood with a large park just a block away. It had a small, fenced-in backyard perfect for Buster, and a bright, airy room that I decided would be my home office. The day I moved in, Sarah, my old college friend, came to help me unpack. We put on music, ordered Chinese food, and filled the new space with laughter. It was the first time in years I had felt so light, so unburdened. That evening, after Sarah had left, I sat on the floor of my new living room, surrounded by boxes. Buster was asleep at my feet, his side rising and falling in a steady, comforting rhythm. The setting sun streamed through the large windows, bathing the room in a warm, golden light. This was mine. This peace, this quiet, this safety. I had earned it. I had fought for it. It wasn't something that had been given to me. It was something I had seized from the wreckage of my past. I pulled out my laptop and opened a web browser. I didn't search for news about my mother's upcoming sentencing. I didn't look up real estate. I typed in a different set of search terms. How to start a nonprofit. Grants for animal-assisted therapy programs. Psychiatric service dog training certification. A business plan began to take shape in my mind. The Michael Reed Foundation for Survivors, a nonprofit dedicated to providing psychiatric service dogs, free of charge, to victims of psychological abuse and gaslighting. I would use the money my father had left me, the money that was supposed to be the instrument of my downfall, and turn it into a weapon of healing for others. I would build a place where the unconditional, non-judgmental honesty of a dog could be the anchor for people lost in a fog of manipulation. I looked down at Buster, my co-conspirator, my bodyguard, my truth-teller. He opened one eye, thumped his tail twice on the hardwood floor, and went back to sleep. The plan felt right. It felt like the perfect ending to my story, and the perfect beginning to the next. They had tried to lock me away in the dark, but they had failed. Now I was going to spend the rest of my life bringing others into the light. The house was empty, the boxes were waiting to be unpacked, and for the first time I felt truly, completely, home. The day of the sentencing felt like the final, heavy page of a long and difficult book. I chose my outfit with deliberate care. A well-tailored navy blue suit, a crisp white blouse. It was armor. It was a statement. It was the uniform of a woman who was no longer a victim, but the president of her own life. I walked into the courtroom alone. I had told Sarah and my other friends that I needed to do this myself. Buster, sadly, was not permitted inside the courtroom, so I had left him with a trusted sitter. Walking through the heavy wooden doors without his solid presence at my side felt strange, but I knew I had to stand on my own 2 feet for this final act. The gallery was sparsely filled with a few local reporters and some legal spectators. Then they were brought in. I hadn't seen them in person since the day of their arrest nearly 6 months ago. The sight of them was jarring. The county jail had stripped them of all their pretensions. Derek was thinner, his face pale and drawn. He looked not like a man, but like a frightened, hollowed-out boy. He wouldn't look at me. My mother's transformation was even more shocking. Her expensive highlights had grown out, leaving a wide gray stripe at her roots. Her face, without its usual meticulous makeup, was puffy and splotchy. She wore the ill-fitting, standard-issue jumpsuit with a look of utter contempt, as if it were a personal insult. She saw me sitting in the front row, and her eyes, cold and hard as river stones, locked onto mine. There was no remorse in that gaze, only pure, unadulterated loathing. She still believed she was the one who had been wronged. Their lawyers gave half-hearted pleas for leniency, citing their lack of a prior criminal record. Then it was the district attorney's turn. He laid out the case in cold, hard facts, detailing the calculated, long-term nature of their conspiracy. He spoke of the medical malpractice, the fraudulent documents, the psychological torture, and the kidnapping. He called their actions a monstrous betrayal of the sacred trust between a mother and child. Then, he called my name. The prosecution would like to read a victim impact statement from Miss Clara Reed. He had offered to read it for me, but I had refused. This was something I had to do myself. I walked to the podium, my heels clicking softly on the marble floor. I unfolded the paper, but I didn't look at it. I had memorized the words. I looked directly at the judge, a stern-faced woman with intelligent eyes. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and steady. "For 2 years, my mother and my brother tried to steal my mind. Before they could steal my inheritance, they had to convince me and the world that I was insane. They used medication to confuse me. They used lies to isolate me. And they used my love for them as a weapon against me. They almost succeeded." I paused, then turned my head slightly, letting my eyes sweep over them. But they made a critical error. They underestimated me. And they underestimated my dog. In their world of lies, he was the one thing that could not be corrupted. He was my truth teller, and he gave me the strength to find my own. I turned back to the judge. "They didn't just try to steal my money, Your Honor. They tried to erase me, to lock me away, physically and mentally, and replace my identity with a diagnosis that would serve their greed. Today, I am not here to ask for revenge. I am here to ask for justice. Justice for the years they stole from me, and justice that ensures they can never do this to anyone else. They are not victims. They are predators, and they need to be held accountable for their choices." I finished, folded the paper, and walked back to my seat, my heart pounding but my head held high. The judge looked over the documents in front of her for a long time. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a cold, righteous anger. She addressed Derek first. She spoke of his parasitic lifestyle, his greed, and his willing participation in the torture of his own stepsister. She sentenced him to 8 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole in 5. Then she turned to my mother. "Mrs. Reed," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you have committed one of the most reprehensible betrayals I have ever seen in this courtroom. You were given the sacred duty of protecting your child, and you chose instead to become her predator. You show no remorse, no understanding of the profound damage you have caused. You are a danger to society, and frankly, to anyone who is unfortunate enough to trust you." She delivered the sentence. "On the charge of kidnapping, I sentence you to 15 years in state prison. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, I sentence you to 5 years, to be served concurrently. You will be eligible for parole in 12 years. A gasp went through the courtroom. 15 years. It was more than anyone expected. My mother's face crumpled. The cold mask of hatred shattered, replaced by a look of raw, animalistic shock. For the first time, the reality of her future, a future spent growing old in a prison cell, hit her. She let out a strangled sob as the bailiffs led her away. The gavel came down with a final echoing crack. It was over. I stood up, walked out of the courtroom, and into the bright, clear light of day, not looking back. The drive home from the courthouse was surreal. The world outside the car windows, people walking their dogs, drinking coffee, living their ordinary lives, seemed to be moving at a different speed. My own world had just experienced a tectonic shift, a final, definitive closing of a chapter, and yet the rest of the world just kept on going. I didn't feel the surge of triumphant joy I had expected. Instead, I felt a profound sense of quiet. The silence in my car wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of relief, of grief, of exhaustion, and of a fragile, nascent peace. The war was officially, legally, and finally over. When I got home and opened the door, Buster was waiting, his whole body wiggling with excitement. I dropped my purse and my keys and knelt on the floor, burying my face in his soft, warm fur. He licked away the tears I hadn't realized were falling. He didn't know what had happened in that courtroom, but he knew his job. He knew I needed him. We spent the rest of the afternoon at the park. I sat on a bench, throwing a tennis ball for him until my arm ached. Watching his simple, unadulterated joy as he bounded across the grass felt like a balm to my soul. He was a living, breathing reminder that happiness didn't have to be complicated. That evening, I didn't want to be alone. I called Sarah. "It's done," I said. That was all I needed to say. An hour later, she was at my door with 2 large pizzas and a bottle of ridiculously expensive champagne. "To Clara Reed," she said, raising her glass. "The strongest damn woman I know." We didn't talk much about the sentencing. We didn't need to. Instead, we talked about the future. We talked about silly things, about movies and books and plans for a weekend trip to the coast. We talked like the 2 young women we were, whose lives were just beginning. It was the most normal I had felt in years. After she left, I found myself in my new home office. The room was still mostly empty, save for a desk and a chair. I took out a fresh legal pad and a pen. At the top of the page, I wrote the name I had been thinking about for weeks: the Buster Foundation. The idea that had been a vague concept now began to take concrete shape. My mind, which for so long had been consumed with legal strategies and survival tactics, was suddenly buzzing with creative energy. I started sketching out a mission statement: to rescue, train, and place psychiatric service dogs with survivors of psychological abuse, empowering them to reclaim their lives with a partner in healing. I wrote down ideas for program names: the Anchor Program, the Truth Teller Initiative. I started outlining the steps I would need to take: filing for nonprofit status, finding a location, hiring expert trainers, creating a curriculum not just for the dogs, but for the new handlers as well. For hours I worked, the words and ideas flowing out of me. The pain of the last few years was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface. But for the first time, I felt like I was successfully metabolizing that pain into purpose. I was taking the worst thing that had ever happened to me and turning it into the best thing I would ever do. My father had left me his money. My mother had left me with scars. But Buster had given me a mission. The court case was over. The doors were locked on my past. Now it was time to build a new door, one that would open onto a future filled not with fear, but with hope. And it would be a door that I would hold open for as many people as I could. The transition from survivor to founder was the most challenging and rewarding work of my life. The Buster Foundation wasn't just a project, it became my reason for getting up in the morning. It was the place where all the broken pieces of my past could be reassembled into something strong and beautiful. My first official act was hiring an executive director. I knew I had the vision and the resources, but I needed someone with experience in the nonprofit world. Someone who knew how to navigate the complexities of fundraising, compliance, and program management. Patricia Evans introduced me to a man named David Chen. a retired nonprofit executive who had spent 30 years running a shelter for homeless youth. David was in his late 60s, with a kind face and a sharp, incisive mind. When I told him my story and my vision for the foundation, he didn't just see the potential, he saw the profound need. "Clara," he said, after I had finished, "in all my years of working with vulnerable people, the deepest wounds I've seen are the invisible ones, the ones left by emotional and psychological abuse. What you're proposing to do, it's not just innovative, it's essential." He agreed to come on board as a consultant to help me get the foundation off the ground. Our next task was to find the perfect location. I didn't want a sterile office building. I wanted a place that felt like a sanctuary, a place where both people and dogs could feel safe enough to heal. We spent weeks scouting properties. Finally, we found it. A 20-acre former horse farm just outside of town. It had a large, well-maintained farmhouse that could be converted into offices and meeting rooms, a huge barn that was perfect for an indoor training facility, and acres of fenced-in pasture where the dogs could run and play. The moment I stepped out of the car and breathed in the clean country air, I knew this was it. We bought the property outright. The work of renovating and building began. We designed state-of-the-art kennels that felt more like cozy dorm rooms than cages. We built agility courses and sensory training areas. We designed quiet, comfortable rooms where survivors could meet their potential canine partners for the first time. While the physical space was taking shape, I focused on building our team. I knew the most important hire would be our head trainer. I didn't just want someone who knew dog obedience. I needed someone who understood the unique and sensitive work of training psychiatric service animals. My research led me to a woman named Maria Sanchez, a former Army veteran who had been a trainer for the military's elite canine corps. After leaving the service, she had dedicated her life to training service dogs for veterans with PTSD. She was tough, intuitive, and had a connection with dogs that was almost supernatural. When I interviewed her, I asked her what the most important quality in a psychiatric service dog was. I expected her to say intelligence or obedience. "Honesty," she said without hesitation. "A dog is a mirror. It can't lie about what it senses. For someone whose reality has been systematically distorted, that mirror is a lifeline. The dog becomes the anchor that proves the storm is real and that they are not crazy for feeling the way they do." She understood. She understood the very core of what I was trying to do. I hired her on the spot. Buster, of course, was a constant presence during this entire process. He was the official mascot, the chairman of the board, the inspiration for it all. He would trot alongside me as I inspected the construction, his tail wagging. He would sit in on meetings with David and Maria, occasionally letting out a soft snore from under the table. His calm, steady presence was a reminder of our mission, our why. Months of hard work culminated in a day I will never forget. The renovations were complete, the staff was hired, and the first truck arrived from a network of rescue shelters we had partnered with. It was carrying our first cohort of potential service dogs, 10 dogs of all breeds and sizes, carefully selected for their temperament and potential. As the ramp was lowered and the first dog, a gentle-eyed golden retriever, walked out into the sunshine and onto the soft green grass of his new home, I felt tears welling in my eyes. This was real. It was happening. Out of the ashes of my attic prison, we were building a haven, a place where lost souls, both human and canine, could find each other and begin the journey of healing together. The first few months of the Foundation's operation were a whirlwind of controlled, beautiful chaos. The farm, which we officially named The Anchor, came to life. The sounds of joyful barking, the quiet commands of trainers, and the low hum of dedicated work filled the air. Maria Sanchez, our head trainer, was nothing short of a magician. She and her team didn't use force or dominance-based training. Their methods were built on positive reinforcement, trust, and an uncanny understanding of canine psychology. It was a philosophy of partnership, not ownership. I learned so much just by watching them. I learned that training a psychiatric service dog is less about teaching them to obey and more about empowering them to use their natural instincts in specific, helpful ways. They weren't just learning sit and stay. They were learning to recognize the subtle shifts in human biochemistry that signal rising anxiety or a panic attack. They were trained in task-specific skills that sounded like a secret language. Block, standing between their handler and another person to create space. Cover, standing behind their handler to make them feel safe in a crowd. And deep pressure therapy, Buster's signature move. One of the most incredible things they learned was tactile interruption. A dog could be trained to recognize a handler's specific self-harming or repetitive stress behaviors, like scratching their skin or nervously bouncing a leg, and to interrupt the behavior by nudging them with their nose or placing a paw on them. We sourced our dogs primarily from rescue shelters. Maria had a gift for seeing the potential in a dog that others might have overlooked. "You don't need a perfectly bred dog," she would say. "You need a dog with a good heart and a steady soul. Sometimes the ones who have had a rough start are the most empathetic." It was a beautiful parallel that wasn't lost on me. We were a foundation of survivors helping survivors. Buster took on the unofficial role of Dean of Students. He was older now, with a touch of gray around his muzzle, but he had a calming effect on the new dogs. He would greet each new arrival with a dignified sniff and a slow, welcoming wag of his tail. He seemed to model the calm, confident demeanor that was the hallmark of a good service animal. The trainers often joked that he was teaching the other dogs more than they were. While the dogs were in their intensive training, which could last anywhere from 6 to 8 months, we were also building the other side of our program, the human side. We developed a careful, compassionate application and interview process for the survivors who would receive our dogs. We partnered with therapists and domestic abuse shelters to get referrals. Reading the applications was the hardest part of my job. The stories were harrowing, each one a unique variation on the themes of manipulation, control, and psychological terror that I knew so well. I saw my own story reflected in their words. I saw the self-doubt, the confusion, the isolation. And I saw the desperate flickering hope for a way out. Our first chosen applicant was a young woman I'll call Anna. She was in her early 20s and had just escaped a relationship where her partner had gaslit her so severely that she had been hospitalized for what she believed was a nervous breakdown. She was out now, living in a small apartment, but she was terrified of the world. She couldn't be in crowded places. She had crippling panic attacks. She felt, in her own words, like a ghost. As Anna went through the final stages of the approval process, one of our dogs was also distinguishing himself in training. A 2-year-old black Labrador mix named Sam, whom we had pulled from a high-kill shelter just a day before he was scheduled to be euthanized. Sam was gentle, preternaturally calm, and incredibly intuitive. He excelled at DPT and interruption tasks. Maria came to me one afternoon. "It's Sam," she said. "He's the one for Anna. I've never seen a clearer match." We were ready. Our first dog was ready. Our first survivor was ready. The two halves of our mission were about to come together. The theoretical work was done. Now we were about to see if we could truly change a life. The day Anna came to the Anchor to meet Sam for the first time, there was a palpable sense of nervous excitement in the air. This was the moment everything had been building towards. This was our proof of concept, the culmination of all the renovations, the training, the planning. Anna was a small, fragile-looking woman with large, haunted eyes. When she stepped out of her car, she was visibly trembling. The world was a frightening place for her, and our quiet farm was still part of that world. David, our executive director, and I went out to greet her. "Welcome to the Anchor, Anna," I said, keeping my voice soft. "We're so glad you're here." I introduced her to Buster, who gave her hand a gentle lick. She flinched at first, then relaxed, a tiny, hesitant smile touching her lips. We didn't rush her into meeting Sam. First, we just sat with her in one of our quiet rooms, drinking tea and talking. We told her about Sam's personality, his favorite toys, the funny way he snored. We wanted her to meet him as an individual first, not as a piece of medical equipment. When she felt ready, we walked out to a private fenced-in garden area. Maria was already there with Sam. He was sitting patiently at her side, his tail giving a few slow, curious thumps against the grass. He wasn't boisterous or overwhelming. He was just present. "Anna, this is Sam," Maria said softly. She unclipped his leash. "He's all yours." Sam didn't rush over. He stood up, stretched, and then walked slowly towards Anna, his gait relaxed and confident. Anna had frozen, her hands clenched at our sides. She looked like a frightened deer. Sam stopped a few feet away from her. He didn't jump or bark. He just sat down and looked at her with his soulful brown eyes. He seemed to understand that she needed space. He let her come to him. For a full minute, they just looked at each other. Then, very slowly, Anna knelt down. Sam wagged his tail once. She reached out a trembling hand and rested it on his head. Sam leaned into her touch, letting out a soft, contented sigh. And then, Anna began to cry. Not loud, hysterical sobs, but the silent, shoulder-shaking tears of someone who had been holding it all in for far too long. Sam didn't back away. He moved closer, nudging his head under her hand, and then he began to lick the tears from her face. It was one of the most profound things I have ever witnessed. It was a connection forged in a language older than words, a language of shared vulnerability and unconditional acceptance. In that quiet garden, a partnership was born. Anna and Sam spent the next 2 weeks at the Anchor in what we called the bonding phase. They stayed in a small, private guest cottage on the property. Maria and her team worked with them every day, teaching Anna Sam's commands, showing her how to work with him as a team. We watched her transform. The woman who had arrived trembling and terrified began to stand up straighter. The haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a growing confidence. We'd see her walking the grounds with Sam, her head held high, speaking to him in a low, loving voice. He was her constant shadow, her anchor in the unsteady sea of her trauma. On her last day, we did a final field trip to a busy local grocery store, a place she had been unable to enter for months. I went with her and Maria. As we walked inside, I could see the old panic start to rise in her. Her breathing became shallow. Sam, walking calmly at her side, sensed it immediately. He stopped and gently pushed his body against her legs, grounding her. Then he looked up at her, as if to say, "I've got this." Anna took a deep breath, placed a hand on his back, and took another step. Then another. She made it through the entire store. She bought a week's worth of groceries. When we got back to the car, she was crying again. But this time, they were tears of triumph. "I did it," she whispered, her face buried in Sam's neck. "I did it." As she drove away from the Anchor that day, with Sam sitting proudly in the passenger seat beside her, I knew we had succeeded. We hadn't just given her a dog, we had given her back a piece of her own life. We had given her a partner who would never lie to her, a friend who would always have her back. We had given her a future, and there was no inheritance in the world that could ever be worth more than that. A year after Anna and Sam graduated from our program, the Buster Foundation held its first official fundraising gala. It was a milestone that felt both monumental and deeply surreal. The event was held in a large, beautifully decorated tent on the grounds of the Anchor. String lights twinkled in the trees, and the air was filled with music and the excited chatter of over 200 guests. The gala wasn't just about raising money. It was a celebration of survival and a public declaration of our mission. It was my official step out of the shadows. For so long, I had been the subject of whispered gossip and sordid headlines. Tonight, I was standing before my community as the founder of a thriving organization, a creator of hope. I had agonized for weeks over my speech. How could I possibly distill the horror of my past and the hope for my future into a 10-minute address? In the end, I decided to do the only thing I could: tell the truth. As I stepped up to the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. Buster, wearing a distinguished-looking bow tie for the occasion, was sitting at my feet. "Good evening," I began, my voice stronger than I thought it would be. A few years ago, my world shrank to the size of a single locked room. I was told that my own mind was my enemy, that my reality was a lie. In that darkness, the only thing that remained true was the love and loyalty of my dog. He couldn't speak, but he told me the most important truth of all: that I wasn't crazy. The situation was. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw friends, supporters, my lawyer Patricia, and even Detective Harding, who had come in her civilian clothes. The Buster Foundation was born from that truth, I continued. We believe that for every person who has been lost in the fog of psychological abuse, there is an anchor. For many of the people we serve, that anchor has 4 legs, a wet nose, and a heart that cannot be taught to lie. We rescue dogs who need a second chance, and we train them to become lifelines for people who need one even more. I told them about Anna and Sam. I told them about the 3 other survivors we had since placed dogs with, each with their own story of courage and healing. I told them about our waiting list, which was already growing longer every day. They tried to use my father's legacy to destroy me, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Tonight, with your help, we are using that same legacy to build a sanctuary. We are turning a story of darkness into a legacy of light. When I finished, the tent erupted in applause. It was a wave of warmth and support that washed over me, healing a part of me I didn't even know was still broken. People stood up, their faces shining. It wasn't pity, it was respect. Later that evening, a woman I didn't know came up to me. She was impeccably dressed and had tears in her eyes. "My sister," she said, her voice a near whisper. "She was in a marriage like that for 20 years. She got out, but she's just a shell of who she used to be. Thank you. Thank you for giving people like my sister a reason to hope." The event was a staggering success. We raised enough money to fund our operations for the next 2 years and to double the number of dogs we could train. A local news station that was covering the event ran a feature story the next night. The headline wasn't about my sordid past. It was about my hopeful future. From prisoner to pioneer, Clara Reed's Foundation gives survivors a new leash on life. As the last guests departed and the staff began to clean up, I stood alone in the quiet tent, looking out at the moonlit fields of the anchor. Buster came and rested his head on my knee. I had done it. I had rewritten my own story. The name Clara Reed was no longer associated with victimhood. It was associated with strength, with resilience, and with the unwavering belief that even after the deepest betrayal, it is possible to build a life of purpose and of peace. 2 years after the sentencing, life had settled into a rhythm that was both busy and profoundly peaceful. The Buster Foundation was thriving. We had successfully placed 12 dogs with survivors, and our reputation was growing. My days were filled with meaningful work, my evenings with quiet contentment. The ghosts of the past still whispered now and then, but their voices were faint, drowned out by the joyful noise of my new life. Then, a letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to my townhouse, but to the foundation. It was from the chaplain of the state correctional facility where my mother was incarcerated. My heart did a familiar, sickening lurch. I took the letter to my office and closed the door before I opened it. The chaplain wrote that he had been meeting with my mother, Eleanor, for several months. He said she was struggling to come to terms with her situation and that she spoke of me often. The letter was carefully worded, full of therapeutic jargon about reconciliation and restorative justice. But the core of it was a request. My mother wanted to see me. The chaplain wrote that she was prepared to offer an apology and begin the process of making amends. He suggested that a face-to-face meeting might provide closure for us both. I read the letter 3 times. My first visceral reaction was a hard, resounding no. The thought of being in the same room with her, even with a wall of plexiglass between us, made my skin crawl. What could she possibly say that would change anything? The word sorry felt like an insult, a drop of rain on a raging inferno. But another, smaller part of me was curious. Was it possible? Could 2 years in prison have broken through her wall of narcissism and forced her to confront the reality of what she had done? Was there a glimmer of the mother I thought I knew, hidden somewhere inside that bitter, hateful woman? I took the letter to my next session with Dr. Sharma. She read it, her expression unreadable. "What do you want to do, Clara?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me feels like I owe it to the little girl I was to hear her out. But the adult in me is screaming that it's a trap. "Let's analyze that," Dr. Sharma said. "What would be the best-case scenario of this meeting?" "She gives a genuine, heartfelt apology," I said. "She takes full responsibility. She explains why she did it, not as an excuse, but as an explanation. And I get some kind of closure." "And the worst-case scenario?" "It's a manipulation," I said, the words coming easily now. "She blames me. She blames my father. She plays the victim. She tries to guilt me into helping her with her parole hearing in 10 years. And I walk out of there feeling re-traumatized and furious with myself for falling for it." Dr. Sharma nodded. "Which scenario, based on everything you know about your mother's personality, do you think is more likely?" The answer was obvious. I knew my mother. The woman who had looked at me with pure hatred in the courtroom was not a woman on the verge of a profound moral awakening. She was a performer, and this was just a new role she was trying out, the penitent inmate. "It's a trap," I said, the last flicker of hope extinguishing. "It's your choice, Clara," Dr. Sharma said gently. "But you don't owe your abuser a chance to re-harm you in the name of a closure they are incapable of giving you. Sometimes the most powerful form of closure is choosing not to engage. It's a final declaration that they no longer have any power over you, not even the power to command your presence." Her words resonated with a deep, profound truth. I had already found my closure. It was in my work, in my friendships, in the quiet peace of my home. I didn't need her apology to be whole. My wholeness was no longer dependent on her in any way. That evening, I wrote a short, polite letter back to the chaplain. I thanked him for his work and his concern. I wrote, "I appreciate you reaching out. However, I have come to realize that my own healing requires me to maintain a safe and permanent distance from the source of my trauma. I wish Eleanor peace, but I will not be visiting. My closure has already been found elsewhere." I sealed the envelope and dropped it in the mail. It felt like the final bolt sliding shut on the door to my past. But this time, I was the one holding the key, and I was locking the door from the outside, keeping the monsters safely inside, where they could never hurt me again. My life took on a beautiful, predictable rhythm, the kind of comforting routine I had craved for years. Each day was a quiet testament to the life I had built. My mornings began not with a jolt of anxiety, but with the soft nudge of a wet nose. Buster, now a venerable old gentleman with distinguished silver fur around his muzzle, was my alarm clock. We'd start each day with a walk in the park near my townhouse as the sun came up. The air would be cool and clean, and the simple act of watching my dog chase a ball as the world woke up felt like a form of meditation. After our walk, I'd drive to the Anchor. Pulling up to the farm each day filled me with a sense of purpose that was almost overwhelming. This place, this haven, was real. I had made it real. My days were a mix of administrative work, donor meetings, and my favorite part, spending time with the dogs and the survivors. I wasn't a trainer or a therapist, but I had a unique role. I was the living proof that healing was possible. I would often sit in on the initial meetings between a survivor and their potential dog. I wouldn't say much. I would just be there, a quiet presence of understanding. I knew the fear in their eyes. I knew the tremor in their hands. And I knew the profound, life-altering magic that was about to happen when a dog laid its head in their lap. One particular afternoon, I was watching Maria work with a new dog, a skittish German Shepherd mix named Luna, who had been rescued from an abusive situation. Luna was afraid of her own shadow. Maria wasn't trying to force her into obedience. She was just sitting on the grass, tossing a soft toy and ignoring the dog, letting Luna come to her. It was a lesson in patience, in allowing healing to happen on its own timeline. It was a perfect metaphor for my own journey. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't force it. You just had to create a safe space and wait for the trust to grow. My evenings were my own. Sometimes Sarah would come over and we'd cook dinner and watch bad movies. Other times I would simply enjoy the quiet solitude of my own home. I took up painting, something I had loved as a child but had abandoned. I filled my house with bright, abstract canvases, expressions of emotions I couldn't always put into words. The house was no longer just a place I lived. It was a reflection of me. It was filled with books, with art, with the smell of good coffee, and with the soft snores of a sleeping dog. There were no hidden motives, no whispered conspiracies. The silence was just silence. It was peaceful. One night I was sitting on my back patio reading a book. Buster was lying at my feet. The stars were out. A profound sense of gratitude washed over me. I thought about the woman in the attic, the one who had scratched the days into the wall, who had whispered her plans to her dog in the dark, who had hoped, against all odds, for a future she couldn't even imagine. I wished I could go back and tell her that she would make it, that she would be okay, that one day she would be sitting on a patio of a home that was truly hers, with her dog at her feet, under a sky full of stars, feeling nothing but peace. I couldn't tell her, of course, but I could live the life she had fought so hard for me to have. And that's what I did. Every single day. I lived for her. I lived for all the other survivors who were still locked in their own attics, waiting for their own truth-teller. I lived a life that was quiet and purposeful and good. And it was more than enough. It was everything. Buster was getting old. It was a slow, gentle decline, marked by small changes. He was a little slower to get up in the mornings. His sprints after the tennis ball in the park became more dignified trots. His muzzle, once a sandy yellow, was now almost entirely white. With his age came a new depth to our bond. We had been through a war together, and now we were enjoying the long, peaceful armistice. He was no longer just my service dog. He was the keeper of my history, the silent witness to my transformation. I made adjustments for him. I bought him an orthopedic bed for his aging joints. I installed a small ramp so he could get into the car without having to jump. My life, which had once revolved around a frantic fight for survival, now revolved around the comfort and happiness of my oldest and dearest friend. His role at the foundation had shifted as well. He was no longer the active dean of students. He was more like the revered, retired professor. He spent most of his days snoozing in a patch of sun in my office. The staff all adored him, sneaking him treats and stopping by to give him a gentle scratch behind the ears. He was a living legend, the dog the foundation was named for. One day, Maria came into my office, a worried look on her face. "It's about Luna," she said. Luna was the timid German Shepherd who was still struggling to trust people. She was making progress, but it was slow. "She's hit a wall. She won't engage with any of the trainers today." I looked over at Buster, who lifted his head, his ears perked. On a whim, I said, "Let's try something." I clipped the leash onto Buster's collar, and we walked slowly out to the training field where Luna was huddled in a corner, refusing to make eye contact. I sat down on the grass a good distance away and simply unclipped Buster's leash. Buster didn't approach Luna directly. Instead, he did something remarkable. He walked to the center of the field, picked up a soft toy, and began to play with it by himself. He'd toss it in the air, pounce on it, and roll on his back with his paws in the air. The picture of pure, unthreatening joy. Luna watched him. For a long time, she just watched. Then, slowly, cautiously, she got to her feet. She took a few tentative steps towards him. Buster ignored her, continuing his one-dog party. Luna crept closer, her curiosity overriding her fear. Finally, she let out a small, playful bark. Buster stopped, looked at her, and dropped the toy. He gave a low, happy woof and nudged the toy towards her with his nose. It was an invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Luna picked up the toy. A gentle, tentative game of tug-of-war began. Maria and I watched, tears in our eyes. It was a breakthrough. He hadn't used commands or techniques. He had used the universal language of kindness and play. He had shown her that the world wasn't a scary place, that it was safe to trust again. He was still a healer, still a teacher. That night, as Buster slept soundly in his bed next to mine, I thought about his legacy. He wouldn't live forever. The thought was a sharp, painful ache in my chest. But I realized that his legacy wasn't just in my own survival. It was in every dog that graduated from our program. It was in the life of every survivor who learned to trust again because of a partnership with an honest, loving animal. We had decided to name the main training building at the Anchor the Buster Sanchez Center, in honor of both him and Maria. His picture, a handsome portrait of him in his prime, hung in the lobby. His story and our story would live on. He had started a ripple of healing that would continue long after he was gone. He was more than just a good dog. He was a great soul, and the love he had brought into the world would be his lasting monument. I scratched his soft old head, and he sighed in his sleep. I was the luckiest woman in the world. The ceremony was small and intimate, held on a sunny afternoon in the garden at the Anchor. It was a graduation for our 20th dog and handler team, a young man named Michael, and a goofy, lovable golden retriever named Gus. Michael had survived years of emotional abuse from his parents, and the trauma had left him with severe agoraphobia. He hadn't been able to leave his apartment for almost a year. Today, he stood before our staff and a few other graduates, his hand resting on Gus's back, and he gave a short, heartfelt speech. "Before Gus," he said, his voice trembling but clear, "my world was four walls. I thought that was all it would ever be. But this dog, he isn't just my service animal. He's my courage. He's my bridge back to the world." He looked down at Gus, who gazed up at him with absolute adoration. He showed me that I was worth saving. And now, thanks to him, I'm finally saving myself. I stood at the back, watching, my heart full to bursting. This was why I had fought so hard. This was the legacy of my pain, transformed into someone else's hope. Buster was sitting at my side, his old body leaning against my leg. He was almost 13 now, and his time was growing short. But he had lived to see the incredible forest that had grown from the single seed of his loyalty. He had done his work well. My work was to carry it on. After the ceremony, I sat with him on a bench overlooking the fields where the new trainee dogs were playing. The sun was warm on my face. The war was long over. The peace was deep and it was real. And I was profoundly, unshakably happy. Looking back on this story, it's easy to see it as a simple tale of good versus evil, a daughter against a monstrous mother. But the reality of psychological abuse is rarely that simple.
It's a subtle, insidious poison. My mother and brother weren't cartoon villains. They were deeply broken people whose greed and narcissism eclipsed their humanity.
Their mistake wasn't just their cruelty, but their profound arrogance. They believed they could control my reality because, for years, they had. They were wrong. My mistake was a common one. I trusted people I loved, even when my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. I was programmed to doubt myself before I doubted them. The truth is, Eleanor was always who she was. Her love was a transaction, her concern a performance. Derek was a weak man who chose the easy path of a parasite rather than the hard work of building his own life. Their punishment wasn't just the prison sentences. It was the public destruction of the false image they had spent a lifetime creating. They got exactly what they deserved. As for me, my journey wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. Reclaiming my sanity, my identity, and my future. The turning point wasn't just the evidence. It was the moment I chose to trust an external, objective truth-teller, my dog, over the manipulative words of my abusers. That's the critical lesson here. Gaslighting works by isolating you inside your own head. The way out is to find an anchor in objective reality, whether it's a loyal pet, a trusted friend, a therapist, or just the cold, hard facts you can write down in a journal. You have to find a truth outside the abuser's narrative. The consequence of not doing so is the loss of your own soul. The way to mitigate that damage is to fight for your own perspective as if your life depends on it, because it does. This story isn't just about my survival. It's a testament to the quiet strength of every person who has ever been made to feel crazy by the people who were supposed to love them. Your reality is valid. Your feelings are real. And you are not alone. So I want to ask you, and I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where your gut instinct screamed a truth that was different from what everyone else was telling you? What or who has been the buster in your life? That unwavering source of truth that helped you find your way back? Thank you for being here with me. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.